Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where winter silence stretches for miles and the nearest town feels like another world entirely, there stands a forest of antennas. 180 metallic towers rising from the frozen earth, each one aimed at the sky. They hum with power when activated, sending invisible beams of concentrated energy upward into the ionosphere itself. The official story calls it science, research into atmospheric behaviour and radio wave propagation. But what if those antennas were doing something else? What if the facility wasn't just listening to the sky, but learning how to control it? What if weather patterns, earthquakes, even human consciousness itself could be manipulated by the right frequency broadcast from the right location? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most persistent and unsettling conspiracy theories of the modern era, the story of HAARP, and the possibility that the sky above us is no longer entirely natural. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review truly helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribing really makes a difference. Also, a huge thank you to Mike for suggesting this topic. This one's for you. Now, let's head north. To the cold, to the isolation, and to the antennas that some believe touch something they were never meant to reach. Chapter 1. The Facility in the Wilderness. Gakona, Alaska sits roughly 200 miles northeast of Anchorage. It's a tiny community, population barely over 200 people. The landscape is harsh. Long winters, short summers, endless stretches of forest and tundra. It's the kind of place where you go if you want to disappear, or if you're building something you don't want the world to see. In the early 1990s, construction began on a research facility, unlike anything most people had ever encountered. It wasn't a weapons testing range, it wasn't a missile silo. It was a field of antennas, rows and rows of them, stretching across 33 acres of cleared land. Each antenna stood 72 feet tall. Together they formed what would become the most powerful ionospheric heater ever constructed. The project was called the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP. It was a joint effort, funded and operated by the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The official mission was straightforward. Study the ionosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere where charged particles interact with solar radiation. Understand how radio waves behave in that region. Improve communication systems for military and civilian purposes. Enhance radar technology. All legitimate scientific goals. But the scale of the facility raised questions almost immediately. If this was just research, why did it require such immense power? Why build it in one of the most remote locations in the country? And why involve multiple branches of the military in what was supposedly a benign atmospheric study? From the very beginning, HAARP was shrouded in secrecy. Not the kind of secrecy that comes from classified stamps and blacked out documents, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes from isolation, from limited public access, from vague descriptions of purpose. And in that silence, speculation began to grow. The facility's remote location made it nearly impossible for casual observers to monitor its activities. No residential neighbourhoods nearby, no schools or hospitals that might raise concerns about electromagnetic radiation exposure. Just wilderness, military jurisdiction, and a perimeter that kept civilians at a comfortable distance. Construction crews who worked on the project were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Standard practice for military contractors, but it added another layer of mystery. What exactly were they building out there? And why did it need to be so far from civilization? The antennas themselves were unlike typical radio towers. They weren't designed to broadcast commercial signals or relay communications. They were built to concentrate enormous amounts of electromagnetic energy into focused beams that would be fired directly into the upper atmosphere. The engineering required for such a system was extraordinary. Each antenna had to be precisely calibrated, synchronized with the others, capable of handling extreme power loads without overheating or failing. When the facility was completed in the late 1990s, it represented a technological achievement that few outside the scientific community fully understood. To most people, it was just a field of metal towers in Alaska, but to those who began investigating its purpose, it was something else entirely, a tool that could, theoretically, reach up and touch the edge of space itself, and perhaps pull something back down. Local residents noticed changes almost immediately. The facility would activate periodically, sometimes for hours at a time. During these periods, strange things happened. Electrical equipment would malfunction. Radio signals would become garbled or disappear entirely. The sky itself seemed different, charged with an energy that felt unnatural. Some dismissed these observations as coincidence or misunderstanding. Others began to wonder if the facility was doing exactly what conspiracy theorists would later claim, experimenting with forces that humanity had no business manipulating. Chapter 2. The Man Behind the Patents. To understand the conspiracy theories surrounding HAARP, you have to go back further. Back to a physicist named Bernard Eastlund. Eastlund was a scientist working in the field of plasma physics and ionospheric research during the height of the Cold War. He was brilliant, unconventional, and deeply interested in the practical applications of theoretical physics. While others focused on academic papers and laboratory experiments, Eastlund was thinking about what could be built, what could be done with enough energy, enough precision, enough understanding of how the atmosphere worked. In the 1980s, he filed a series of patents that would later become the foundation for much of the speculation around HAARP. The most notable was patent number 4,686,605, titled Method and Apparatus for Altering a Region in the Earth's Atmosphere, Ionosphere and Magnetosphere. The language in the patent was striking. It didn't just describe studying the ionosphere, it described altering it, heating specific regions of the upper atmosphere with focused radio frequency energy, creating concentrated zones of charged particles that could be manipulated, moved or directed at will. The patent outlined potential applications that read like something from a science fiction novel, disrupting enemy communications by creating artificial disturbances in the ionosphere that would scatter or absorb radio signals, enhancing friendly radar and surveillance systems by modifying atmospheric conditions to improve signal propagation, modifying weather patterns by influencing atmospheric energy distribution, potentially steering storms or dispersing hurricanes before they made landfall. But the most alarming section dealt with the possibility of triggering seismic activity. Eastlund's patent suggested that by directing enough energy into specific regions of the ionosphere, and by carefully modulating that energy, it might be possible to influence tectonic processes deep beneath the Earth's surface. The mechanism was complex, involving the interaction between ionospheric heating and the magnetosphere, which in turn could affect geomagnetic currents flowing through the planet's crust. These currents, the patent suggested, might be capable of adding stress to already strained fault lines, potentially triggering earthquakes in geologically vulnerable areas. Eastlund himself claimed his work was theoretical, speculative, a thought experiment about what might be possible if enough energy could be focused in the right way. He insisted his patents were never intended to describe an actual weapon, but rather to explore the outer boundaries of what ionospheric research might achieve. But the details were too precise, too specific. They read less like academic musings and more like blueprints. The patent included technical specifications, power calculations, antenna configurations, and frequency ranges. It described exactly how such a system might be built, how it would operate, and what effects it could produce. When HAARP was announced in the early 1990s, conspiracy researchers immediately drew the connection. The facility's design matched Eastlund's concepts almost exactly. High-powered transmitters arranged in a phased array configuration, antennas capable of focusing energy into narrow beams that could be steered electronically toward any point in the sky. Ionospheric heating as the core mechanism, with power levels that exceeded anything previously attempted in atmospheric research. It was as if someone had taken his patents off the shelf, classified them, and decided to build them in the most remote location they could find. Eastlund himself would later distance himself from HAARP, at least publicly. He gave interviews where he claimed the facility was using his ideas, but had gone beyond what he originally envisioned. Whether that meant HAARP was less ambitious than his patents suggested, or far more dangerous, he never fully clarified. His statements were always carefully worded, leaving room for interpretation. Some believed he was walking back his earlier work because he realised the implications of what he had designed. Others thought he was under pressure from government agencies to downplay the connection between his patents and the actual facility. A few conspiracy theorists suggested he'd been threatened, forced to publicly deny involvement while privately continuing to consult on classified projects. Eastlund passed away in 2007, taking whatever deeper knowledge he had with him, but the patents remain, public record, available for anyone to read, and they describe capabilities that sound less like science and more like the tools of gods, or perhaps something worse, the ability to reach into the atmosphere and reshape it according to human will, the power to turn weather itself into a weapon, the means to shake the Earth's foundations from hundreds of miles away. Whether HAARP was ever intended to fulfill these purposes remains a matter of intense debate, but the fact that someone thought they were possible, designed systems to achieve them, and then saw a facility built that matched those designs almost perfectly, is undeniable. Chapter 3. The Array itself. When HAARP became fully operational in the late 1990s, it consisted of 180 antennas arranged in a rectangular grid covering 33 acres of Alaskan wilderness. Each antenna was a towering steel structure, 72 feet tall, capable of transmitting radio waves at frequencies between 2.8 and 10 megahertz. Together they could generate a combined effective radiated power of 3.6 billion watts. To put that in perspective, most commercial radio stations operate at power levels measured in thousands or tens of thousands of watts. HAARP's output dwarfed them by orders of magnitude. It was by far the most powerful radio frequency transmitter ever built for ionospheric research. Nothing else in the civilian or even most military installations came close to matching its raw power output. The antennas worked in coordination, forming what's called a phased array. By carefully timing the transmission from each individual antenna, the array could focus its energy into a concentrated beam. That beam could be steered electronically, aimed at specific regions of the ionosphere without physically moving the antennas themselves. The precision was remarkable. Operators could target a section of sky no larger than a few kilometers across, located hundreds of miles overhead, and heat it to temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding atmosphere. When activated, the array would send pulses of energy upward. Those pulses would travel through the lower atmosphere, largely unaffected by clouds, moisture, or air density. They would pass through the stratosphere without significant interaction. But when they reached the ionosphere, roughly 50 to 300 miles above the Earth's surface, something remarkable happened. The energy would interact with charged particles, primarily electrons and ions floating in the thin upper atmosphere. These particles would absorb the radio frequency energy and convert it into heat and motion. Temperatures in the targeted region could increase by several hundred degrees. The electron density would change, creating disturbances that could be measured by instruments on the ground and in space. Scientists called this ionospheric heating. The process was observable, measurable, and theoretically well understood. During active experiments, researchers could detect changes in electron density, temperature, and electromagnetic behavior in the targeted region. They could study how these changes affected radio wave propagation, how long the heated region took to cool back down, and how the disturbance spread through the surrounding ionosphere. Occasionally the heating would create artificial auroras, visible glows in the night sky, similar to the northern lights but localized and controlled. These auroras appeared as patches of green, red or purple light that would shimmer and pulse in rhythm with HAARP's transmission patterns. They were beautiful, eerie, and unlike anything most people had ever seen. For researchers, this was invaluable. It allowed them to study how the ionosphere responded to energy inputs under controlled conditions. They could test theories about plasma physics, investigate how solar storms might affect satellite communications, and develop better models for predicting how radio signals would behave during different atmospheric conditions. All useful data for improving satellite communications, GPS accuracy, and over-the-horizon radar systems. But for conspiracy theorists, the implications were far darker. If HAARP could heat a section of the ionosphere, could it push that heated air downward? The ionosphere, despite being incredibly thin, still interacts with the denser atmosphere below through various mechanisms. Heated regions create pressure differences. Differences drive wind. Wind affects weather patterns. Could HAARP create artificial high-pressure zones that would redirect jet streams? Could it intensify storms by adding energy to already unstable atmospheric systems? Could it trigger droughts by persistently heating regions above agricultural areas, disrupting normal precipitation patterns? The physics of such scenarios were debatable. Mainstream atmospheric scientists argued that HAARP's energy output, while impressive for a human-built device, was utterly insignificant compared to the natural forces that drive weather. The sun pumps trillions upon trillions of watts into Earth's atmosphere every second. HAARP's few billion watts, applied to a tiny section of the upper atmosphere for a few minutes at a time, would be like trying to change the course of a hurricane by throwing ice cubes at it. But conspiracy theorists pointed to chaos theory, the butterfly effect, the idea that small changes in a complex system can cascade into large effects through feedback loops and amplification. What if HAARP wasn't trying to overpower natural weather systems, but rather to nudge them at critical moments? A small push applied at exactly the right time and place could, theoretically, have disproportionate effects, and if the energy could influence particles in the sky, what might it do to the electrical systems in the human brain? The brain operates on electrical impulses. Neurons fire through electrochemical signals that propagate at specific frequencies. If external electromagnetic fields could interfere with those frequencies, could they alter thoughts, emotions, or perceptions? This was where the conspiracy theories became truly unsettling. Because unlike weather manipulation, which would require enormous sustained power outputs, influencing human cognition might be achievable with much more subtle effects. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to certain types of electromagnetic interference. Studies had shown this, repeatedly in laboratory settings. The question wasn't whether it was possible, but whether HAARP was designed to do it. Chapter 4. Weather as a Weapon. The idea that HAARP could manipulate weather became one of the most enduring aspects of the conspiracy theory. The logic, at least on the surface, seemed plausible to those without deep knowledge of atmospheric physics. Weather is driven by energy. Solar radiation heats the surface of the Earth unevenly, creating temperature differences that drive wind, ocean currents, and storm systems. The ionosphere plays a role in this process, absorbing and redistributing energy from the sun, affecting how much solar radiation reaches the lower atmosphere. If you could heat specific regions of the ionosphere, you could theoretically create localized changes in atmospheric pressure and circulation patterns. Conspiracy researchers pointed to Eastlund's patents, which explicitly mentioned weather modification as a potential application. They cited statements from military strategists who had written about environmental warfare as a future tool of geopolitical conflict. A 1996 Air Force research paper titled "Weather as a Force Multiplier: Owning the Weather in 2045" became a frequent reference point. The document outlined hypothetical scenarios where weather control could be used to enhance military operations, disrupt enemy logistics, or create strategic advantages without firing a single shot. The paper was speculative, clearly labelled as a thought exercise about future possibilities rather than current capabilities, but its very existence proved that military planners were thinking about weather warfare. They were considering how it might be achieved, what technologies would be required, and what advantages it would provide. HAARP, theorists argued, was the secret implementation of these ideas. The facility's location in Alaska, near the Arctic jet stream, seemed deliberate. The jet stream is a river of fast-moving air that flows around the planet at high altitudes, steering weather systems across entire continents. By heating the ionosphere above that region, they claimed, operators could influence the jet stream's path. A heated section of the ionosphere could create an atmospheric bulge, a zone of altered pressure that might deflect or slow the jet stream. This, in turn, could redirect weather systems, steering storms towards some regions and away from others. Unusual weather events began to be attributed to HAARP almost immediately after the facility became operational. Severe droughts in California during the early 2000s, unprecedented flooding in the Midwest, hurricanes that shifted course unexpectedly, defying meteorologists' predictions, blizzards that arrived with unusual intensity, breaking historical records. Each event, for believers, was evidence of invisible manipulation. The devastating Hurricane Katrina in 2005 became a focal point. The storm had intensified rapidly in the Gulf of Mexico before slamming into New Orleans with catastrophic results. Conspiracy theorists noted that HAARP had been conducting experiments during the weeks leading up to the hurricane's formation. They produced charts showing alleged correlations between HAARP activity and the storm's strengthening. They suggested the hurricane had been intentionally guided toward New Orleans, though the motives attributed to this alleged attack varied wildly depending on which conspiracy narrative you followed. The scientific community rejected these claims almost universally. Meteorologists pointed out that HAARP's energy output, while impressive by human standards, was minuscule compared to the natural forces that drive weather systems. A single hurricane contains more energy than HAARP could generate in a year of continuous operation. Heating a small section of the ionosphere for a few minutes couldn't compete with the trillions of watts of energy constantly flowing through Earth's atmosphere from the sun. Moreover, the mechanisms proposed by conspiracy theorists didn't align with established atmospheric physics. Heating the ionosphere doesn't create pressure changes in the troposphere where weather occurs. The ionosphere is too high, too thin, and too disconnected from the dense air below to directly influence storm systems. There are interactions between different atmospheric layers, but they operate on timescales and through mechanisms that don't match the rapid, targeted effects attributed to HAARP. But correlation, however flimsy, is persuasive to those who want to believe. When HAARP conducted an experiment and a hurricane intensified a week later on the other side of the continent, believers saw a connection. They created timelines, marked dates on calendars, produced graphs that seemed to show patterns. When the facility went silent for maintenance and weather patterns seemed more stable, they saw confirmation. The narrative became self-reinforcing. Videos appeared online showing HAARP's antenna array glowing at night. The visible light from control systems and security lighting transformed in the footage into something ominous and otherworldly. These images were shared thousands of times, accompanied by claims that the facility was actively manipulating a storm system or preparing for an attack. Amateur radio operators reported unusual interference during periods of extreme weather. Some claimed they could hear strange patterns in the static, rhythmic pulses that didn't match any known natural or artificial source. These recordings were analysed endlessly by conspiracy communities, with some claiming they decoded messages or identified specific frequency signatures that matched HAARP's transmission capabilities. Then there were the drought patterns. California suffered through multiple years of severe drought in the 2000s and 2010s. Water reservoirs dropped to historically low levels. Agriculture suffered. Wildfires became increasingly common and severe. Some conspiracy theorists suggested this wasn't natural climate variation or the result of climate change, but deliberate weather manipulation. By preventing storms from reaching California, by redirecting atmospheric rivers that would normally bring rain to the west coast, HAARP was allegedly being used to economically damage the state, punish its liberal politics, or force population migration. Similar theories emerge for every major weather disaster: the European heatwave of 2003, the Russian wildfires of 2010, the flooding in Pakistan that same year. Each event was analysed, connected to dates when HAARP might have been operational, and incorporated into the narrative of weather warfare. And then there were the earthquakes, which took the conspiracy to an even darker place. Chapter 5: Shaking the Earth. If weather manipulation seemed far-fetched to mainstream scientists, the earthquake theories took things to an even more extreme level. Yet they became just as widespread, if not more so, particularly in regions that had experienced devastating seismic events. The claim was this: HAARP's energy beams, directed into the ionosphere, could somehow penetrate downward into the Earth's crust. By targeting specific fault lines or tectonic boundaries with precisely modulated radio frequency energy, the facility could trigger seismic activity, earthquakes on demand, a weapon more devastating than any bomb, and one that would appear entirely natural, leaving no evidence of human involvement. The idea wasn't entirely without precedent, which gave it a veneer of plausibility. Scientists have long known that energy can influence tectonic stress. Underground nuclear tests, for example, have occasionally triggered minor seismic events in the hours or days following detonation. Deep injection of wastewater in oil and gas operations has been definitively linked to increased earthquake frequency in certain regions. The principle that adding energy to a geologically stressed system can push it past a tipping point is real and well documented. But HAARP's energy doesn't work that way, according to mainstream physics. Radio waves at the frequencies it transmits don't penetrate the Earth's surface in any meaningful way. They interact with charged particles in the ionosphere, far above the ground, and then dissipate as heat and electromagnetic radiation. There's no mechanism for those waves to transfer energy deep into the crust, let alone do so with enough precision to target a specific fault line thousands of miles away. Still, the theory spread rapidly, particularly after major seismic disasters. The devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti, which killed over 200,000 people and left much of the capital in ruins, became an early focal point. Conspiracy theorists noted that unusual atmospheric phenomena had been reported in the days before the earthquake. Strange lights in the sky, unusual cloud formations, electromagnetic disturbances that affected radio communications. They produced charts showing alleged HAARP activity in the weeks leading up to the disaster. The theory suggested that HAARP had deliberately targeted Haiti, either as a test of earthquake weapon capabilities or as part of some geopolitical agenda. The motives attributed to this alleged attack varied. Some claimed it was a test run for future weapons deployment. Others suggested it was meant to destabilise the region for economic or political reasons. A few even claimed it was connected to oil exploration rights or attempts to establish military bases in the Caribbean. The 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan became an even larger conspiracy narrative. The massive magnitude 9 earthquake and subsequent tsunami killed over 18,000 people and triggered a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. It was one of the worst natural disasters in modern history, and conspiracy theorists immediately began looking for evidence of HAARP involvement. They found what they were looking for, or at least what they believed they'd found. Reports of unusual radio interference before the earthquake, atmospheric disturbances detected by satellites, allegations that HAARP had been conducting experiments at the exact time the earthquake occurred. Videos appeared online claiming to show evidence of electromagnetic disturbances in the ionosphere above Japan in the days leading up to the disaster. The 2015 Nepal earthquake, which killed nearly 9,000 people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings, followed a similar pattern. Conspiracy communities analysed seismic data, atmospheric conditions, and alleged HAARP transmission schedules, producing elaborate timelines that seemed to show connections between facility activity and the disaster. Skeptics pointed out that correlation is, not causation, a basic principle of logic that seemed to hold no weight in these communities. The Earth experiences tens of thousands of earthquakes every year. The vast majority are small and cause no damage, but several dozen significant earthquakes occur annually. Finding a few that happened during periods when HAARP was operational proved nothing. It would be statistically unusual if there weren't such correlations, given how frequently both earthquakes and HAARP experiments occur. But for believers, the pattern was undeniable. They created databases cataloguing major earthquakes alongside alleged HAARP activity. They produced graphs showing what they claimed were significant correlations. They shared these materials widely, creating an evidence base that seemed convincing if you didn't look too closely at the methodology. Some theories went even further, suggesting that HAARP could be used not just to cause earthquakes but to direct tsunamis. The mechanism proposed involved creating underwater seismic events in specific locations that would generate waves travelling in predictable directions. By carefully choosing where to trigger the earthquake, operators could theoretically aim the resulting tsunami at specific coastlines while leaving others unaffected. Other variations suggested HAARP could destabilize volcanic regions, create artificial sinkholes, or even alter the Earth's magnetic field in ways that would affect tectonic processes. These theories became increasingly elaborate, incorporating elements from geology, plasma physics, and electromagnetic theory, often misunderstanding or misrepresenting the actual science involved. The facility in this telling was a tool of geophysical warfare capable of reshaping the planet's surface at will, a weapon that could destroy cities without leaving fingerprints, that could be used to punish enemy nations or destabilize regions targeted for regime change, all while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, earthquakes are natural. They happen all the time. How could anyone prove that a particular earthquake was artificially triggered rather than a random act of geology? No credible scientific evidence supported any of these claims. Seismologists who studied the earthquakes in question found nothing unusual about them. They occurred along known fault lines, in regions with documented seismic risk, and displayed characteristics entirely consistent with natural tectonic processes. The energy required to trigger a major earthquake is so enormous that even nuclear weapons can only produce relatively minor seismic events. HAARP's power output is orders of magnitude smaller than a nuclear weapon. But the lack of evidence didn't stop the theories from spreading. If anything, it reinforced them. The absence of proof, believers argued, was itself proof. If HAARP's true capabilities were being hidden, if the technology was classified and the operations were conducted in secret, then of course there would be no public data confirming them. The lack of transparency was the transparency. The denial was the admission. And so the earthquake conspiracy became a permanent fixture of the HAARP narrative, impossible to disprove because it was structured to treat all contradicting evidence as confirmation of the cover-up. Chapter 6: Frequencies of the Mind. But the darkest theories surrounding HAARP, the ones that provoke the deepest unease and the most intense speculation, had nothing to do with weather or earthquakes. They had to do with the human brain. The idea was rooted in the undeniable fact that the brain operates electrically. Neurons communicate through electrical impulses, generating electromagnetic fields that can be measured with sensitive equipment. Thoughts, emotions, perceptions, consciousness itself, all of it arises from patterns of electrical activity firing across billions of cells in intricate networks. And electrical activity can be influenced by external, electromagnetic fields. This isn't speculation, it's established neuroscience. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, for example, uses powerful magnetic fields to influence brain activity, treating depression and other neurological conditions. Deep brain stimulation implants use electrical pulses to modify neural firing patterns in patients with Parkinson's disease. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic influences. Conspiracy theorists pointed to decades of research into the effects of electromagnetic radiation on human cognition and behavior. Studies conducted throughout the Cold War had shown that exposure to certain frequencies could alter mood, induce sleep, cause disorientation, or produce feelings of anxiety. Extremely low frequency waves in particular had been shown to penetrate the human skull and interact with brainwave patterns more effectively than higher frequencies. Military researchers in both the United States and Soviet Union had explored these effects extensively. Declassified documents from the Cold War era revealed experiments where subjects were exposed to various electromagnetic frequencies to determine if their behavior could be modified. Some studies showed measurable changes in reaction time, mood, and cognitive function. Others were inconclusive or showed only subtle effects, but the research demonstrated that the concept wasn't pseudoscience. The brain could be influenced electromagnetically. HAARP, theorists claimed, was capable of broadcasting such frequencies on a massive scale. Not directly, but through a process called modulation. The facility's high-frequency transmissions couldn't directly affect the brain. They operated at frequencies far too high for neurons to respond to. But by pulsing those high-frequency transmissions in specific patterns, HAARP could create extremely low-frequency waves in the ionosphere itself. Here's how it would work, according to the theory. HAARP's powerful transmitter sends radio waves into the ionosphere, heating the charged particles there. By rapidly modulating the heating on and off, by pulsing the energy at extremely low frequencies, perhaps between 1 and 100 cycles per second, you could make the entire heated region of the ionosphere vibrate at that same low frequency. The ionosphere would act like a giant speaker membrane, generating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves that would propagate downward through the atmosphere. Unlike the high-frequency carrier signal, these extremely low-frequency waves could penetrate deep into the Earth, through mountains and oceans, and through human tissue including the brain. They're the same frequencies at which human brainwaves operate. Delta waves during deep sleep, theta waves during meditation, alpha waves during relaxed wakefulness, beta waves during active thinking. If you could broadcast a signal at the right frequency, with the right pattern, could you influence which brainwave state people experienced? The implications were beyond chilling. If you could broadcast a frequency that induced fear, you could incapacitate an enemy population without firing a shot. Imagine an entire city gripped by inexplicable terror, unable to think clearly, unable to organize resistance. If you could broadcast a frequency that induced compliance or suggestibility, you could control public behavior during times of unrest. Protests could be dispersed not with tear gas and batons, but with an invisible signal that made people docile, cooperative, eager to follow instructions. If you could broadcast a frequency that disrupted concentration or memory, you could undermine a rival nation's workforce and military effectiveness. Students couldn't study, workers couldn't focus, soldiers couldn't execute complex operations. The economic and military consequences would be devastating, and the cause would be invisible, undetectable without specialized equipment. This wasn't just wild speculation. The concept had historical roots that conspiracy theorists traced back to the Cold War. During that era, both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted research into psychotronic weapons, devices designed to influence human cognition through electromagnetic means. The Soviets allegedly developed systems capable of inducing hallucinations, paranoia, and physical discomfort in targeted individuals. Some of these systems were supposedly tested on dissidents, political prisoners, and even foreign diplomats. The United States explored similar technologies under various classified programs. Some of this research was connected to MKUltra, the CIA's notorious mind control experiments. While most of MKUltra focused on chemical methods, primarily LSD and other drugs, some branches of the program investigated electromagnetic approaches. Declassified documents confirmed this, though the details remained heavily redacted. HAARP, in this framework, was the next evolution, a system capable of broadcasting mind-altering frequencies not to a single target in a laboratory or prison cell, but to entire regions, whole cities, potentially even larger areas, depending on ionospheric conditions and the power levels employed. A silent weapon that could turn populations against themselves, erode trust between communities, amplify existing divisions and conflicts, and destabilize societies from within without anyone understanding what was happening to them. There were anecdotal reports, though unverified and impossible to confirm, of people living near the HAARP facility experiencing unusual symptoms during active transmission periods. Severe headaches that came on suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Episodes of vertigo and disorientation. Unexplained anxiety and feelings of dread that had no apparent cause. Auditory hallucinations typically described as low humming or buzzing sounds that seemed to come from inside their heads rather than from any external source. Skeptics attributed these to environmental factors, the stress of living in an isolated community, the psychological impact of knowing about the facility and its controversial reputation. The power of suggestion is real. If you expect to feel strange during certain times, if you're anxiously monitoring your own mental state for signs of external influence, you can create symptoms through expectation alone. This is basic psychology, well documented in countless studies. But for those who experienced these symptoms, the explanations felt inadequate. The headaches were too sudden, too severe, the vertigo too disorienting. the anxiety too intense to be mere imagination. They felt like something external was affecting them, invading their minds, disrupting normal brain function. Some tried to document the pattern, keeping logs of when they felt symptoms and comparing them to information about HAARP's operational schedule. The facility didn't publish detailed transmission logs, but some operational. Data was available through FOIA requests or leaked through various channels. A few people claimed they'd found correlations, that their symptoms reliably appeared during periods when HAARP was known to be active and disappeared when the facility was shut down. These accounts circulated through conspiracy communities, collected and analysed for patterns. Some researchers tried to map symptom reports geographically, looking for concentrations that might indicate where HAARP's effects were strongest. Others investigated whether certain individuals might be more sensitive to electromagnetic fields, more susceptible to whatever HAARP was allegedly broadcasting. And then there was the connection to an older, darker program, one that proved the government had already experimented with mind control, one that showed they were willing to destroy lives in pursuit of that goal, a program whose shadow still loomed over every conspiracy theory about secret government operations. Chapter 7. The shadow of MKUltra. MKUltra was real. That much is not disputed by anyone, not even the most skeptical debunkers of conspiracy theories. Declassified documents, congressional testimony, and investigative journalism have all confirmed that the Central Intelligence Agency conducted illegal experiments on unwitting American citizens throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The goal was to develop methods of mind control, techniques that could break down an individual's will, implant false memories, induce compliance, or extract information without the subject being aware of what had been done to them. The program used drugs, primarily LSD and other hallucinogens, administered to subjects without their knowledge or consent. It used sensory deprivation chambers, where subjects would be isolated in darkness and silence for days or weeks, their minds gradually deteriorating under the stress. It used psychological torture, carefully calibrated to maximize suffering while minimizing visible physical injury. It used electroshock therapy, sometimes at levels far beyond what was medically justified, scrambling memories and personalities. The program destroyed lives. Some subjects were left permanently damaged, their minds fractured by the experiments conducted on them, unable to function in normal society. A few committed suicide, driven to desperation by symptoms they couldn't understand, and no one would help them treat. Others lived for decades not knowing what had been done to them, suffering mysterious psychological problems whose true cause remained hidden in classified files. The program was officially shut down in the early 1970s after journalists began investigating rumours of CIA experiments. The agency's director ordered MKUltra's records destroyed to prevent them from being discovered during congressional investigations. Most of the documentation was successfully eliminated, but some survived, enough to piece together the broad outlines of what had been done. Congressional hearings in the mid-1970s exposed the program to public scrutiny for the first time. Victims testified about their experiences, though many were dismissed as unreliable due to their psychological problems that were themselves caused by the experiments. The CIA admitted to some activities, but downplayed the scope and severity, claiming the program had been an unfortunate but limited aberration, a product of Cold War paranoia that would never be repeated. But conspiracy theorists argue that MKUltra didn't end. It evolved, went deeper underground, adopted new methods that were harder to trace. The chemical methods were crude, unpredictable, difficult to scale beyond individual subjects or small groups. They left evidence, medical records, drug supplies, testimony from subjects who survived. But electromagnetic methods, those offered something entirely different. Precision without physical contact, repeatability without chemical trails, the ability to affect large populations without anyone knowing they'd been targeted. HAARP, in this interpretation, was the spiritual and technological successor to MKUltra, a system designed not to control individuals in laboratory settings, but to influence masses of people in their normal environments. No drugs required, no physical detention, No face-to-face interaction, just electromagnetic fields propagating invisibly through the atmosphere, subtly altering the electrical activity in millions of brains simultaneously. The theory suggested that the lessons learned from MKUltra, how certain chemical compounds could induce altered states of consciousness, how sensory deprivation affected mental stability, how repeated trauma could break down personality structures, were applied to electromagnetic research. Scientists asked new questions. Could electromagnetic fields replicate the effects of LSD without the need for chemical administration? Could they induce sensory deprivation by disrupting normal brain processing of sensory information? Could they create psychological stress by interfering with the neural circuits that regulate emotion? Preliminary research, some of it published in obscure journals, some of it allegedly classified, suggested the answer might be yes. Electromagnetic fields at certain frequencies could influence neurotransmitter release. They could affect the blood-brain barrier's permeability, potentially altering which substances reach neural tissue. They could interfere with calcium channels in nerve cells, changing how neurons fired and communicated with each other. This aligned with another persistent conspiracy belief, that global elites, shadowy governments, or secret organizations sought to control humanity through invisible means. Not through overt force, which creates resistance and rebellion, but through subtle manipulation that people don't recognize as external influence, make the population anxious enough that they demand security measures, make them distracted enough that they don't notice their rights eroding, make them divided enough that they fight each other instead of questioning those in power. HAARP fit perfectly into that narrative, a hidden facility funded by military agencies whose budgets are largely classified, conducting experiments that were never fully disclosed to the public, possessing capabilities that sounded like science fiction but were grounded in real, documented physics. Located in one of the most remote regions of North America, far from oversight, far from journalists who might ask inconvenient questions. No direct evidence linked HAARP to mind control experiments of the type conducted under MKUltra. No whistleblowers came forward with first-hand accounts of such programs. No documents were leaked describing cognitive influence operations. No victims testified about being targeted by electromagnetic weapons based at the facility. But the absence of evidence once, again, was interpreted as concealment. If the program was classified at the highest levels, if its true purpose was hidden behind layers of compartmentalization and security clearances, if the operators had learned from MKUltra's mistake of leaving paper trails, then of course there would be no proof. The technology was invisible, the effects were subtle, the deniability was perfect, and so the theory persisted. It evolved, merging with other conspiracies. It became a foundational element of a broader belief system that saw invisible forces manipulating reality itself. HAARP wasn't just a weather weapon or an earthquake generator. It was a consciousness control grid, a tool for reshaping human thought and behaviour on a planetary scale. Chapter 8. Lights in the Sky. For those living near Gakona, for the handful of families and individuals who made their homes in that remote region of Alaska, HAARP was impossible to ignore. Not because of its antennas, which were visible but static, standing silently most of the time, but because of what happened when the facility powered on. Witnesses reported strange lights in the sky, phenomena that appeared with such consistency during HAARP operations that even skeptics couldn't dismiss them entirely. Glowing patches of green, red and purple light would appear in the night sky, rippling and shifting like auroras, but behaving in ways that natural auroras never did. They would appear in locations where auroras shouldn't be visible at all, too far south or at times when solar activity was minimal. They would pulse in rhythm, brightening and fading with a regularity that seemed too precise to be random. Scientists explain this as ionospheric luminescence, a known and well-documented side effect of ionospheric heating experiments. When HAARP's energy beams excited electrons in the upper atmosphere, those electrons would absorb the radio frequency energy and move to higher energy states. When they eventually released that energy and returned to their normal states, they would emit photons, particles of light, in the visible spectrum. The result was artificial auroras, human-made light shows created by concentrated electromagnetic energy. The colours depended on which gases were being excited and at what altitudes. Green light typically came from oxygen at lower ionospheric altitudes. Red came from oxygen at higher altitudes. Purple and blue came from nitrogen. By carefully controlling the frequency and power of its transmissions, HAARP could theoretically create auroras in specific colours, though whether this was intentional or merely a side effect of the heating process remained unclear. For scientists, these artificial auroras were fascinating. They provided visual confirmation that the heating was working, that energy was being deposited where intended, that the ionosphere was responding as predicted. Researchers would sometimes photograph these auroras, publishing the images in scientific papers or presenting them at conferences as examples of successful experiments. But for those who witnessed them without understanding the mechanism, the lights were deeply unsettling. They didn't behave like normal auroras. Natural auroras flow across the sky, curtains of light that dance and shimmer with organic randomness. HAARP's auroras appeared suddenly in isolated patches, remained stationary or moved in geometrically precise ways, and disappeared just as abruptly when the transmission ended. Some described them as feeling wrong, as if the sky itself had been broken, torn open to reveal something underneath that humans weren't meant to see. The lights had an artificial quality, a sense of being manufactured rather than natural, that provoked unease even in people who didn't believe in conspiracy theories. There were other reports beyond the visible lights. Radio interference that disrupted CB radios, ham radio operators, and even some commercial broadcasts during HAARP operations. Electronic devices malfunctioning without explanation, particularly older equipment that wasn't well shielded against electromagnetic interference. Compasses spinning erratically, the needles refusing to settle on magnetic north, instead wandering in confused circles. These effects were consistent with the electromagnetic disturbances HAARP was designed to create. Radio frequency interference was expected when you're pumping billions of watts of radio energy into the atmosphere. Electronic malfunctions were predictable when strong electromagnetic fields were present. Compass disruption made sense if the facility was affecting local geomagnetic conditions. But for people experiencing these effects without the benefit of scientific explanation, they reinforced the sense that something unnatural was happening. Their technology was being affected by invisible forces. The fundamental laws of nature, like magnetic north, seemed temporarily suspended. Reality itself felt less stable during HAARP operations. Pilots flying near the region occasionally reported unusual atmospheric phenomena that went beyond simple radio interference. Sudden turbulence in otherwise clear skies, powerful enough to jolt aircraft without warning. Visual distortions that made it difficult to judge altitude or distance, particularly when looking upward toward where HAARP's beams would be heating the ionosphere. Strange readings on navigation instruments, compass headings that didn't match GPS data, altimeters giving inconsistent readings. Most of these incidents were attributed to natural ionospheric variability. Alaska is at high latitude, where the ionosphere is naturally more active and unpredictable than at lower latitudes. Solar storms regularly create disturbances that can affect communications and navigation. The aurora borealis itself is evidence of these natural processes at work. But a few incidents remained unexplained even after investigation. Aircraft that experienced severe turbulence with no meteorological cause, navigation systems that failed in ways that didn't match any known technical problem. A handful of pilots reported feeling disoriented or experiencing what they described as vertigo or spatial confusion during flights near Gakona, symptoms that disappeared once they left the area. These reports were never officially connected to HAARP. The facility's operators maintained that their transmissions couldn't affect aircraft systems, that all experiments were conducted with aviation safety in mind, that any coincidental timing was exactly that, coincidence. The Federal Aviation Administration found no evidence of safety hazards related to the facility. And then there were the sounds. This was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the reports, the one that even many skeptics found difficult to dismiss entirely. Low-frequency hums that some people claimed to hear during active experiments. Not everyone heard them. Many residents near the facility never experienced anything unusual, but for those who did, the experience was profoundly disturbing. The sound was typically described as a deep, resonant tone, not loud, but persistent, felt as much as heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, impossible to localize. Some compared it to the hum of distant machinery, others to a musical note held indefinitely, still others to something entirely unlike any normal sound. The tone would last for minutes or hours, then fade away gradually when HAARP presumably stopped transmitting. These sounds, if real and not psychosomatic, might have been caused by extremely low frequency waves propagating through the atmosphere. Such waves can vibrate structures, cause them to resonate at frequencies that become faintly audible. Windows, walls, even the human skull itself might vibrate in response to powerful electromagnetic fields, creating sounds that only some people can perceive, or the sounds might have been direct, stimulation of the auditory system. The inner ear contains hair cells that convert mechanical vibrations into electrical signals the brain interprets as sound. These cells are sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Strong fields, particularly at certain frequencies, can make hair cells fire without any actual sound waves present, creating auditory sensations that seem real but have no external acoustic source. Or they might have been entirely imaginary, the mind creating sensations to match anxiety and fear. The power of suggestion is extraordinary. If you believe you're being exposed to dangerous electromagnetic radiation, if you expect to experience unusual symptoms, your brain can obligingly produce them. But for those who heard the hums, explanations about psychosomatic effects or electromagnetic stimulation of hair cells offered little comfort. The sound felt external, real, unnatural. It felt like evidence that something was reaching down from the sky, penetrating their homes, entering their bodies, doing something to them that they couldn't see or understand but could definitely feel. Chapter 9. The Military's Interest. One aspect of HAARP that even mainstream sources, even official government documents acknowledged was its military utility. The facility was, after all, funded and operated jointly by the United States Air Force and United States Navy, with additional involvement from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Defense applications were always part of the program from its inception. This wasn't hidden or denied. It was stated openly. The official list of military interests included several legitimate and scientifically sound applications. Submarine communication was a major focus. Extremely low frequency waves can penetrate deep into seawater, something higher frequency radio waves cannot do. A submarine cruising at depth is effectively cut off from normal communications, unable to receive or send messages without coming close to the surface and extending an antenna. But extremely low frequency waves can reach submarines hundreds of feet down, allowing contact with vessels that would otherwise be unreachable. HAARP's ability to generate such waves by modulating its ionospheric heating made it valuable for submarine communications research. By understanding how to create more efficient, extremely low-frequency signals, how to encode data into those signals despite their limited bandwidth, how to minimize interference and maximize range, the Navy could improve its ability to communicate with its submarine fleet anywhere in the world's oceans. Over-the-horizon radar was another stated military application. Normally, radar is limited by line of sight. Radio waves travel in straight lines, so a radar station can only detect objects up to the horizon, beyond which the Earth's curvature blocks the signal. But by bouncing radar signals off the ionosphere, operators could detect objects far beyond the line of sight, potentially thousands of miles away. The effectiveness of over-the-horizon radar depends heavily on ionospheric conditions. Changes in electron density, temperature, or electromagnetic properties affect how well the ionosphere reflects radar signals. Understanding these factors, learning how to predict ionospheric behavior, or even modify it to improve radar performance, could provide significant military advantages. Early warning of missile launches, detection of aircraft or ships at extreme ranges, monitoring of adversary military movements all become possible with effective over-the-horizon radar. Signal disruption was a third acknowledged military interest. In a conflict, the ability to jam or degrade an enemy's communications and GPS systems could provide decisive advantages. Modern military operations depend heavily on satellite communications, precision navigation, and real-time data sharing. Disrupt those capabilities and you blind your opponent, force them to operate with outdated information, reduce their ability to coordinate complex operations. Ionospheric heating could create disturbances that interfered with satellite signals or radio transmissions. By heating a region of the ionosphere above an enemy's territory, by creating localized zones of intense electromagnetic activity, HAARP or similar systems could potentially disrupt communications across wide areas. The disturbances would be temporary, lasting only as long as the heating continued, but that might be enough to provide tactical advantages during critical phases of an operation. All of these applications were legitimate, scientifically sound, and openly discussed in HAARP's published research. Congressional testimony about the facility mentioned these purposes. Academic papers detailed experiments testing these concepts. There was no conspiracy here, just straightforward military research into technologies that had obvious defense value. But conspiracy theorists saw these acknowledged applications as merely the tip of the iceberg. If the military was willing to disclose submarine communications, over-the-horizon radar, and signal disruption, what else were they working on that remained classified? What capabilities existed beyond what was publicly admitted? The line between research and weaponization is often thin, sometimes non-existent. Technologies developed for one purpose can easily be adapted for another. A system designed to study atmospheric behavior can also be used to disrupt it. A facility built to improve communications can be used to destroy communications. And a tool capable of heating the ionosphere to enhance radar can, in theory, be turned into something far more dangerous. History provided ample precedent for dual-use technologies being weaponized despite initial claims that they were purely for research or peaceful purposes. Nuclear technology was developed for power generation and medical applications, but its primary use has been military. Chemical research produced pesticides and pharmaceuticals, but also nerve agents and biological weapons. Satellite technology enables GPS, weather forecasting, and global communications, but also precision-guided munitions and surveillance systems that can read license plates from orbit. Why would HAARP be any different? Why trust that a military-funded facility, operated by defense agencies, was limiting itself to benign applications when the same technology could theoretically be used for weather manipulation, earthquake generation, and cognitive influence? There were no confirmed reports of HAARP being used in active military operations, no instances documented in any public source where the facility was deployed to jam enemy signals during a conflict or trigger environmental events as part of a military campaign. No battles where HAARP's influence was apparent, no wars where weather suddenly shifted in suspicious ways that benefited American forces, but the absence of such reports didn't mean they hadn't happened. Classified programs by definition remain hidden. Special access programs, the most secretive military activities, operate with such tight compartmentalization that even high-ranking officials may not know they exist. If HAARP had been used operationally, if experiments had been conducted on live targets during actual conflicts, those facts could easily remain classified indefinitely. Conspiracy theorists pointed to various conflicts where unusual weather patterns or atmospheric phenomena had been observed. The Gulf War in the early 1990s, when unusual electromagnetic disturbances were reported, military operations in the Balkans during the late 1990s, when severe weather sometimes seemed to coincide with NATO bombing campaigns, the Iraq War in the early 2000s, when sandstorms arrived at suspiciously opportune moments for American forces. Were these natural coincidences the kind of weather variability that occurs in any military conflict over any extended period? Or were they evidence of classified weather modification operations using HAARP or similar systems? The data was ambiguous enough that both interpretations seemed possible, depending on your prior beliefs about what governments were capable of and willing to do. And even if HAARP itself had never been used as a weapon, its existence proved that such weapons were possible. It demonstrated that humanity had reached a point where the atmosphere itself could be manipulated, where invisible forces could be directed with precision across vast distances, where the boundary between nature and technology had become so blurred as to be meaningless. That alone was enough to fuel endless speculation about what might be happening beyond public view. Chapter 10: Closure and Continuity. In May of 2014, the Air Force announced that HAARP would be shut down. The decision sent shockwaves through conspiracy communities and raised questions even among mainstream observers who had followed the facility's operations. Funding had been cut, the Air Force explained. The program had accomplished its research goals. The facility was no longer needed for current military priorities. It would be dismantled unless another organisation stepped in to take over operations. The announcement was matter-of-fact, bureaucratic, offering no dramatic explanations or acknowledgements of the controversies that had surrounded HAARP since its inception. For conspiracy theorists, this was a moment of vindication mixed with suspicion. HAARP had become too visible, too controversial, too much of a liability. Shutting it down was a way to end the scrutiny, to move the program elsewhere or transition it into deeper secrecy, where public awareness and amateur investigations couldn't reach. The timing seemed suspicious. HAARP had supposedly achieved its research goals, but ionospheric science is an ongoing field with countless unanswered questions. Why shut down the world's most powerful ionospheric research facility just when it could be producing the most valuable data? Why abandon decades of investment and infrastructure? The answers offered by officials seemed inadequate. Budget pressures affect all military programs, but HAARP's costs were relatively modest compared to weapon systems or major research initiatives. If the facility was genuinely valuable for submarine communications or over-the-horizon radar, why wouldn't the Navy or Air Force find funding to keep it operational? Some theorists suggested the shutdown was cover for transitioning HAARP's capabilities to mobile platforms. Perhaps the lessons learned from the Alaska facility had been applied to ship-based or aircraft-mounted systems that could be deployed anywhere in the world. Mobile ionospheric heaters wouldn't attract the same attention as a fixed installation. They could be moved between locations, used briefly, and then relocated before anyone noticed unusual atmospheric or environmental effects. Others speculated about satellite-based systems. Several patents existed for space-based ionospheric heaters, designs that would use solar panels for power and could maintain position over specific regions of Earth for extended periods. Such systems would be difficult to detect, impossible for the public to visit or monitor, and could operate continuously without the limitations imposed by ground-based facilities. Still others believed the real program had simply gone black, moved into special access programs that operated with no public oversight whatsoever. The Alaska facility had been the unclassified face of ionospheric warfare research. Behind that facade, they argued, much more advanced systems had been developed and deployed using technologies that made HAARP look primitive by comparison. But the shutdown didn't last long, and what happened next complicated these narratives in ways that conspiracy theorists struggle to explain. In August of 2015, control of HAARP was transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The facility would remain operational, but now under academic oversight rather than military control. Research would continue, but with an emphasis on transparency and collaboration with the broader scientific community. The university embraced openness in ways the military never had. They opened the facility to public tours, allowing visitors to see the antennas up close, enter the control buildings, and meet the researchers conducting experiments. They published detailed explanations of ongoing projects on public websites. They hosted open houses where community members could ask questions and observe operations. They invited journalists to visit, encouraging media coverage that would demystify the facility and explain its actual scientific purpose. For mainstream scientists, this was an entirely positive development. It demonstrated that HAARP was exactly what it claimed to be, a research station studying ionospheric physics. The transparency provided by university control addressed many of the concerns that had fueled conspiracy theories. If the facility had been developing weapons or conducting mind control experiments, surely the university wouldn't be giving tours and publishing their research methods. But for believers in the conspiracy, the transfer meant nothing, or even confirmed their worst suspicions. If HAARP's true purpose had always been classified, if the facility had been conducting secret experiments alongside its public research, then handing it over to a university was simply the next phase of the cover-up. The real programs, they argued, had been moved elsewhere before the transfer. The sensitive equipment had been removed, the classified experiments had been shut down, and what the university inherited was just an empty shell. A theatre set designed to look like a research facility, functional enough to conduct basic, anospheric experiments that would satisfy academic oversight, but stripped of whatever capabilities had made it truly dangerous. This interpretation required believing that hundreds of scientists and engineers who now worked at the facility under university control were either ignorant of its former classified programs or complicit in maintaining the cover-up. It required believing that the tours and open houses were elaborate deceptions, showing visitors legitimate equipment while hiding the real capabilities. It required a conspiracy so vast and so perfectly maintained that no one had ever leaked information despite years of opportunities to do so. The conspiracy theory had reached a point where it was essentially unfalsifiable. Evidence against it was interpreted as evidence for it. Transparency was proof of deception. Openness was proof of concealment. The more the university tried to demonstrate HAARP's benign nature, the more conspiracy theorists saw confirmation that something was being hidden. Some believers pointed to the fact that the antennas remained standing, that the facility still operated, as proof that it could be reactivated for classified purposes at any time. Perhaps the military had only handed over day-to-day control while retaining the ability to take command during emergencies or for special operations. Perhaps the university scientists were unknowing cover, conducting real research that served as camouflage for occasional classified experiments. Others insisted the entire Alaska facility had become irrelevant, that whatever HAARP had proven could be done was now being done better elsewhere by systems the public knew nothing about. The antenna field in Gakona was a distraction, they claimed, drawing attention and conspiracy theories while the real ionospheric warfare programs operated in complete secrecy. There was no evidence for these claims, no leaked documents, no whistleblower testimony, no unexplained facilities appearing in satellite, imagery or budget documents. But absence of evidence had long since ceased to matter in the HAARP conspiracy narrative. Epilogue. The sky as a weapon. Stand outside on a clear night and look up. The stars scattered across the darkness. The moon casting its pale light. The vast emptiness of space stretching out beyond human comprehension. For most of human history, the sky was untouchable, a mystery that could only be observed, studied, wondered about, but never controlled or altered by mortal hands. But HAARP proved something fundamental. It proved that humanity had reached a point where even the atmosphere itself, even the ionosphere floating at the edge of space, could be modified by human technology, where energy could be focused and directed with precision across hundreds of miles, where the invisible forces that govern weather, communication, and potentially even consciousness could be manipulated by those with sufficient knowledge and resources. Whether HAARP was ever used for weather control, earthquake generation, or mind manipulation remains a matter of belief rather than proven fact. The evidence is ambiguous, fragmentary, open to interpretation. The official explanations are scientifically plausible and supported by mainstream physics. The conspiracy theories are compelling to many but lack the concrete proof that would convince skeptics. But certain facts are undeniable, regardless of which narrative you believe. The facility existed. 180 antennas generating billions of watts of focused electromagnetic energy. Real hardware, real physics, real effects on the ionosphere that could be measured and observed. The patents existed. Bernard Eastlund's designs for atmospheric modification, weather manipulation, and geophysical warfare applications. Detailed technical specifications that described exactly how such systems might work. The military interest existed. Documented, acknowledged, openly discussed applications for submarine, communications, over-the-horizon radar, and signal disruption. Defense funding, military operators, strategic research goals. The research into electromagnetic effects on human cognition existed. Decades of Cold War experiments, declassified documents, scientific papers showing that brainwaves can be influenced by external electromagnetic fields. All of these pieces are real. The question that divides believers from skeptics isn't whether these technologies and capabilities are theoretically possible. The physics suggests they are, even if implementing them at the scale and with the precision required would be extraordinarily difficult. The question is whether they were actually deployed, whether HAARP or similar systems were ever used for purposes beyond academic research, whether the conspiracy theories describe reality or paranoid fantasy. And that question may never be answered definitively. Classified programs remain classified. Secret operations stay secret. If HAARP was used as a weapon, if ionospheric warfare has been conducted, if minds have been influenced or weather patterns altered by invisible electromagnetic beams, the evidence would be circumstantial at best, ambiguous, deniable, impossible to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The antennas in Gakona still stand. They still transmit during experiments, heating the ionosphere, creating artificial auroras, advancing humanity's understanding of how the upper atmosphere behaves. University researchers publish their findings in academic journals. Students conduct thesis research using the facility's unique capabilities. The scientific work continues, transparent and peer-reviewed. But somewhere in the back of your mind, a question may linger, a doubt that won't quite disappear no matter how many official explanations you read or scientific papers you review. Are the skies above us entirely natural, or have they become something else? A canvas for invisible experimentation that continues beyond public view. A battlefield for silent wars fought with weapons most people don't know exist. A medium through which minds might be subtly influenced, weather patterns carefully steered, reality itself shaped by those who control the right frequencies broadcast from the right locations. The next time you see strange lights in the sky, colours that shimmer and pulse with unnatural regularity, ask yourself whether you're witnessing natural auroras or something manufactured. The next time a storm shifts course unexpectedly, defying meteorologist predictions, consider whether you're seeing chaos theory at work or deliberate manipulation. The next time you feel an emotion you can't quite explain, an anxiety or unease that seems to come from nowhere, wonder whether it originates in your own mind or in electromagnetic fields propagating invisibly through the atmosphere around you. These questions don't have easy answers. Maybe they don't have answers at all. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the uncomfortable, middle ground between official denial and conspiracy belief. Maybe some of what HAARP was accused of was real, while other accusations were paranoid exaggeration. Maybe the facility studied the ionosphere while simultaneously testing capabilities that were never publicly acknowledged. Or maybe it was always exactly what it claimed to be: a research station, a scientific instrument, a tool for understanding the mysterious region where Earth's atmosphere transitions into the vacuum of space. Nothing more sinister than that. You'll have to decide for yourself what you believe. Look at the evidence. Consider the arguments from both sides. Apply whatever standards of proof you think are appropriate. But remember that the sky above you, that vast blue dome that seems so empty and peaceful, contains forces and phenomena that humanity is only beginning to understand. And where there is incomplete understanding, where there are capabilities that sound like science fiction but might be science, fact, there will always be room for doubt. Thanks for listening to this journey into one of modern conspiracy theory's most enduring mysteries. Whatever you believe about HAARP, whatever conclusions you draw from the facts and speculation we've explored tonight, remember to think critically, question official narratives without falling into paranoia, and remain open to the possibility that reality might be stranger and more complex than any single explanation can capture. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to leave a review on Spotify, comment with your location and time zone, and subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries that lurk at the edges of accepted knowledge. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep looking up at the sky with fresh eyes. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your help. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows me to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Also, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's amazing to know this community spans the entire globe. Before we begin, I want to give a huge thank you to Grassblazer for suggesting tonight's topic. This one's for you. Now, let's get into it. The Fourth Exit. The fictional story of Hitler's escape intro. The uncovered dossier. The folder shouldn't have existed. Eamon Weiss knew that the moment his fingers touched the brittle manila edge, jutting from between two files marked Agricultural Trade 1947. He was 3 months into his graduate research fellowship at the Buenos Aires National Archives, scanning declassified Argentine intelligence documents for his thesis on post-war immigration policy. The work was tedious, mind-numbing even. Most days he found nothing but bureaucratic paperwork, visa applications stamped with fading ink, and shipping manifests listing cargo that had long since rotted away. The archive reading room was empty that afternoon, which was unusual even for August, when most researchers fled Buenos Aires for somewhere cooler. The air conditioning rattled and wheezed, barely keeping pace with the oppressive humidity that turned every page he touched slightly damp. Eamon had been working since 9 that morning, sustained only by bitter coffee from the machine in the hallway, and the distant hope that his thesis might actually contain something interesting. But on that humid August afternoon in 2019, everything changed. The unmarked folder had no catalogue number, no reference code, no official stamp. Someone had simply placed it there, wedged between documented history like a secret waiting to be discovered, or perhaps like evidence someone meant to file properly but never did. The folder itself was old, genuine 1940s vintage by the look of it, not a reproduction. Eamon pulled it free with the care his archival training demanded, though his hands were already shaking with the instinct that he'd found something significant. He opened it on the desk, and what he found inside would consume the next 6 months of his life and nearly end it. First there was a photograph, black and white, creased at the corners, clearly taken in the late 1940s based on the clothing style and photographic quality. The image quality suggested it had been taken with a decent camera, not the snapshot quality of amateur photography. It showed a man standing on a wooden dock, mountains rising behind him in sharp peaks that could only be the Andes, a lake spreading out into the distance with that particular clarity of high-altitude water. The man wore a dark suit that looked expensive, European cut, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. But not low enough. His moustache was unmistakable, that distinctive shape that had been caricatured 1,000,000 times. His posture was unmistakable, that particular stiffness that came from military bearing and possibly from the chronic back pain historical records documented. The resemblance to Adolf Hitler was impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away as coincidence. Eamon felt his mouth go dry. This couldn't be what it looked like. It had to be someone who resembled Hitler, or a doctored photo, or some kind of elaborate hoax. But the photograph had that quality of authenticity that came from genuine period materials. The paper stock was right. The chemical degradation patterns were consistent with a 70-year-old image. This wasn't created on a computer. Beneath the photo was a typed message on yellowed paper, the kind of onion skin paper used for carbon copies in the 1940s. The text was in German, typed on what appeared to be a German-manufactured typewriter based on the character shapes. Der Führer lebt. The leader lives. No punctuation, no signature. Just those 3 words that upended 70 years of accepted history. The third item was a flight log, or what appeared to be one. The document was official, stamped with Luftwaffe insignia that Eamon recognised from his studies. The header read May 1945, Luftwaffe Transport Division, Special Operations Command. A list of names followed, most redacted with heavy black ink, but one remained visible, typed clearly, A.H. Weber, A.H. Weber, Adolf Hitler Weber. Or perhaps just a coincidence, except there were no coincidences in a folder like this. The flight log listed departure from Tempelhof Airport in Berlin on May 1st, 1945. Destination, Barcelona, with a notation that read, continuing transport arranged. Continuing transport to where? Finally, there was a sealed envelope, or what had once been sealed. The wax seal had cracked with age, deep fissures running through what appeared to be an official government seal, though too degraded to identify which government. The words stamped across the envelope in faded blue ink were still legible. 11th of July, 45, Naval Intelligence, eyes only. Eamon stared at the envelope for a long moment. Part of him wanted to leave it sealed, to photograph the folder as he'd found it and report it to the head archivist. Let someone else deal with whatever was inside. Let someone else take responsibility for whatever truth or lie this represented. But he had come to Argentina to find something meaningful, something that would make his dissertation matter. And whether this was real or an elaborate fraud, it was certainly meaningful. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on what appeared to be Argentine Naval Intelligence letterhead. The text was in Spanish, and it made Eamon's heart stop. Confirmed arrival of package Alpha via U-boat transport. Subject transferred to Interior Ministry custody as arranged. Recommend maximum security protocol. Subject identification matches provided photographs and physical description. No further naval involvement required. All records to be classified highest level. Package Alpha. Arrived via U-boat. July 11th, 1945. Eamon sat back in his chair, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. This couldn't be real. Adolf Hitler died in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Everyone knew that. It was historical fact, documented, verified, accepted by every serious historian in the world. The Soviets found his body. The war ended. The world moved on. Justice, such as it was served. But the documents in front of him told a different story, and someone had tried very hard to make sure that story stayed buried. Eamon looked around the empty reading room. The security camera in the corner was the old kind, probably not even functional. The archive clerk had left for lunch an hour ago. He was alone with these documents, alone with a secret that could either make his career or destroy his credibility forever. He took out his phone and began photographing everything. Each page, each angle, the envelope, the stamps, every detail. His hands shook so badly the first few photos came out blurred, but he steadied himself and continued. This was too important to mess up. When he finished, he carefully returned everything to the folder and marked his place in the catalogue with a bookmark. He needed time to think, to verify, to figure out what he'd actually found before he showed this to anyone. He left the archives in a daze, walking out into the bright Buenos Aires afternoon without any memory of gathering his things or signing out. The city moved around him, tango music drifting from a cafe, tourists photographing the colourful buildings of La Boca, life continuing as it always had. But Eamon Weiss knew that his life had just changed forever. He'd found something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about history. And deep down, in a place he was afraid to examine too closely, he believed it might be real. Act 1. The final days in Berlin. To understand how the impossible might have become possible, Eamon had to go back to the beginning. Back to those final chaotic days in Berlin when the Third Reich collapsed and the Führer allegedly took his own life. Over the next 2 weeks, Eamon barely slept. He spent his days in the archives, maintaining the appearance of normal research, but his nights were devoted to studying everything he could find about Hitler's final days. He ordered books through international shipping, downloaded declassified intelligence reports, and contacted colleagues who specialised in the period without revealing why his interest had suddenly become so intense. The established historical record was clear, at least on the surface. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on the Reich Chancellery and artillery shells falling on the government quarter every few minutes, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the Führer bunker beneath the city. According to the testimony of witnesses, Hitler shot himself while Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the garden, doused in gasoline, and burned in a shell crater while the battle raged around them. The next day, May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children and then took their own lives. By May 2nd, the Soviets had captured Berlin. The war in Europe was over, or would be within days. But even the official story had cracks in it from the very beginning. Cracks that had never been adequately explained. Cracks that historians had smoothed over with assumptions and reasonable speculation, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The first problem was simple but profound. No Western Allied forces ever saw Hitler's body. The Soviets controlled the bunker and conducted their own investigation entirely in secret. They claimed to have found remains, but the evidence was contradictory and kept classified for decades. When Stalin met with Western leaders at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he made a shocking statement. In July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference where the victorious Allies met to decide the fate of post-war Europe, Stalin told US and British diplomats something that should have raised more questions than it did. When asked directly about Hitler's death, Stalin said plainly that Hitler had escaped. He suggested the former Führer might be hiding in Spain or Argentina, protected by fascist sympathisers who had survived the war. President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill dismissed this as Soviet paranoia or propaganda, another example of Stalin's tendency toward conspiracy thinking. But Stalin's statement was on the record, documented in official conference notes. Why would the Soviet leader, who controlled the bunker and allegedly had Hitler's remains in Soviet custody, claim the man had escaped? What possible reason would he have to make such a claim unless he genuinely believed it, or knew it to be true? Years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian investigators would admit that the remains they initially identified as Hitler's lacked proper verification. The dental records were inconclusive, and based on testimony from witnesses interrogated under duress. The skull fragment that supposedly proved Hitler's death, kept in Moscow's state archive and occasionally displayed as a macabre trophy, turned out after DNA testing in 2009 to belong to a woman, probably someone who died in the bunker complex, but certainly not Adolf Hitler. These weren't conspiracy theories. These were documented historical contradictions, admitted by official sources, published in peer-reviewed journals. The problem was that most people, even historians, simply assumed the Soviets had been incompetent, rather than that they had been deceived, or that Hitler had actually escaped. It was easier to believe in Soviet bungling than to question the fundamental narrative of how the war ended. Eamon spent weeks in the archives, cross-referencing everything he could find about Berlin's final days. He discovered that the chaos of that period created a perfect storm of confusion that could have allowed an elaborate deception to succeed. Thousands of Nazi officials fled the city in the last weeks of the war, disappearing into the rubble and smoke. Some escaped through secret tunnels that connected government buildings to the subway system. Others used forged documents and friendly contacts. Many simply put on civilian clothes and walked out of the city amid the flood of refugees. The Führer bunker itself was a maze of corridors and exits, far more complex than popular imagination suggested. While everyone focused on the main entrance through the Reich Chancellery gardens, other passages led to subway tunnels, maintenance shafts, and emergency routes that connected to other government bunkers and facilities. The bunker had been designed with multiple escape routes because Hitler was paranoid about being trapped underground during an air raid. If someone wanted to stage a death and disappear, The bunker's final hours would have been the perfect opportunity. The complex was under constant artillery bombardment. The few remaining staff were exhausted, terrified, and increasingly drunk as the Reich's alcohol supplies were consumed in a final bout of abandon. Visibility in the garden where the bodies were allegedly burned was nearly zero due to smoke from fires burning throughout the government quarter. The witnesses to Hitler's death were few, and their testimony was contradictory. His valet said he'd seen the bodies. His secretary said she'd only heard the gunshot. The SS guards who allegedly carried the bodies up to the garden and burned them gave testimonies that varied significantly in details. Some said the fire burned for hours, others said only for minutes. Some described bodies burned beyond recognition. Others said the faces were still identifiable, and crucially, the person most qualified to identify Hitler's body, his personal physician Theodor Morell, had left the bunker days before the alleged suicide. The dentist who could have definitively identified Hitler from dental records, Hugo Blaschke, had also fled Berlin. The only person left who knew Hitler's dental work intimately was Kader Heusemann, Blaschke's assistant, and she fell into Soviet hands where her testimony would be controlled entirely by Stalin's investigators. Eamon found something else interesting in his research. In the final weeks, Hitler had become increasingly obsessed with the fate of Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had been captured by partisans and executed. His body hung upside down in a public square for crowds to abuse. Hitler had reportedly told his inner circle that he would never allow himself to be captured, never allow his body to become a trophy for his enemies. What if that obsession had led to planning an escape? What if the suicide story was exactly what Hitler wanted his enemies to believe, so they'd stop looking for him? But escaping Berlin was only the first step. Getting out of Germany entirely, with every Allied soldier and intelligence agent in Europe looking for Nazi leaders, would have required extensive planning, significant resources, and a network of supporters willing to risk everything. Which is exactly what Eamon discovered existed. Act 2. The Escape Plan, the Rat Lines. That's what intelligence agencies called them after the war. The Rat Lines. Escape routes that allowed Nazi war criminals to flee Europe and disappear into South America, the Middle East, and other safe havens far from Allied justice. These weren't rumours or theories. The Rat Lines were real, documented networks that operated with stunning efficiency in the immediate post-war years. Eamon spent days reading declassified CIA and FBI files that detailed these networks, and what he found was both fascinating and disturbing. The routes ran through Italy, Spain, and Portugal, facilitated by sympathetic officials, corrupt bureaucrats who could be bribed, and even elements within the Catholic Church who saw Nazis as potential allies against communism. The most famous route ran from Germany through Austria to Genoa, then by ship to Buenos Aires. Another went through Rome, where a Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganovic operated what essentially amounted to a Nazi underground railroad, providing false papers, money, and passage to war criminals seeking to escape justice. Draganovic was a fascinating character. A Catholic priest with connections to the Vatican, he'd been involved in Croatian fascist movements during the war. After 1945, he set up operations in Rome, ostensibly helping refugees, but in reality running a sophisticated smuggling operation that moved hundreds of Nazi war criminals to safety. He worked out of a seminary, had access to Vatican resources, and was protected by diplomatic immunity. The Allies knew what he was doing, but chose not to intervene, partly because they'd begun recruiting some of the same Nazis for intelligence work against the Soviet Union. The names of those who successfully used these networks reared like a roster of the Third Reich's most wanted, and Eamon documented everyone he could find. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust and administrator of the Final Solution, lived openly in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement for over a decade before Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory, lived in a modest house, and felt safe enough to occasionally speak about his past to German expat friends who shared his ideology. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death who conducted horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz, lived in Argentina and Paraguay for decades, protected by local Germans and corrupt officials. He eventually drowned in Brazil in 1979, never having faced justice for his crimes. For years he practiced medicine under his own name in Buenos Aires. That's how safe he felt. Erich Priebke, SS captain responsible for the massacre at the Ardeatine Caves, where 335 Italian civilians were murdered, lived peacefully in Bariloche, Argentina for almost 50 years before he was finally arrested in 1994. He ran a delicatessen, was active in the German community, and only faced consequences when someone recognised him from a documentary. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon responsible for torture and murder of French resistance members, was actually recruited by US intelligence before being smuggled to Bolivia, where he lived under protection until 1983. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka and Sobibor death camps, escaped to Brazil via the Rat Line and lived there until 1967. The list went on and on, hundreds of documented cases, and those were just the ones that were eventually caught or identified. How many others disappeared successfully and died in comfortable obscurity? These men didn't sneak out of Europe in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had help, organised and systematic help, from networks that remained operational for years after the war's end. They travelled with false papers that were good enough to pass official scrutiny. They had money, often quite a lot of it, that had been smuggled out of Germany before the end. They had contacts waiting for them at their destinations, ready to provide housing and jobs and protection. But what Eamon found next suggested something even more disturbing. Something that indicated the Ratline networks weren't just helping random Nazi war criminals escape, but had been used for someone of the highest possible importance. In the Vatican secret archives, recently made available to researchers after decades of restriction, there was a reference in a 1946 document to what was described as a priority passenger moved through the Italian Rat Line in May 1945. Eamon had gained access to these archives through his university's connections, requesting documents related to post-war refugee movements. What he found was a memo from Bishop Alois Hudal, a Nazi sympathiser who had helped organise escape routes, to Vatican Secretary of State. The memo was carefully worded, using euphemistic language, but the implications were clear. It described arrangements for a priority passenger of utmost historical significance, who required absolute discretion and maximum security measures. The passenger's identity was redacted in the document, blacked out with ink so thick it had bled through to the other side of the paper. The destination was listed only as South Atlantic destination, arrangements coordinated with Argentine representatives. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect to be coincidence. Early May 1945, right after Hitler's supposed death, right when chaos in Europe was at its peak, and tracking individuals was nearly impossible. The term priority passenger was unusual in Ratline documentation. Most papers referred to refugees, displaced persons, or occasionally special cases when dealing with Nazi officials. But priority passenger suggested someone of extreme importance, someone who required the highest level of secrecy and protection, someone whose escape was worth considerable risk and resources. Eamon couldn't prove the priority passenger was Hitler, but he couldn't rule it out either, and the timing, the level of secrecy, the involvement of the highest Vatican officials all suggested someone far more important than the typical Nazi war criminal fleeing justice. And then there were the U-boats. This was where Eamon's investigation took on a new dimension of plausibility, because the submarine story was entirely documented, entirely real, and entirely unexplained by conventional history. In July and August 1945, 2 German submarines surrendered in Argentina under circumstances that remain unexplained to this day. U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata on July 10th, 1945, more than 2 months after Germany's surrender on May 8th. U-977 appeared in August. again weeks after the war had ended. Both submarines had left Norway in early May with crews that refused to explain where they had been or what they had been doing for the intervening months. Eamon found the interrogation reports in Argentine naval archives. The questioning had been perfunctory at best, with Argentine authorities seeming more interested in getting the crews off their hands than in discovering the truth. The German sailors claimed they'd been at sea, unaware the war had ended, and had only surfaced when their supplies ran low. But this explanation made no sense. German U-boats had radios. They would have heard about the surrender. They would have known the war was over, and both submarines had left Norway at almost exactly the same time, following what appeared to be prearranged routes to the same destination. That wasn't coincidence. That was coordination. What's more, both submarines had far more range than necessary to reach Argentina. They could have surrendered to Allied forces in the Atlantic. They could have gone to a neutral port in South America's north. Instead, they'd travelled all the way to Argentina's southern coast, as far from Allied control as possible. Argentine authorities interviewed the crews, but found their stories evasive and contradictory. The submarines were impounded. The crews eventually repatriated to Germany, or allowed to stay in Argentina if they chose, and the incident was largely forgotten amid the chaos of the post-war period. But Eamon discovered something in the Argentine naval archives that had never been publicly disclosed, something that made his hands shake when he found it in a box of unsorted documents. A memo dated July 15th, 1945, 5 days after U-530's arrival, referenced an unmanifested passenger aboard the submarine. The passenger had allegedly disembarked before the submarine's official surrender and had been transferred to protective custody per arrangements with Interior Ministry. The passenger's identity was not listed. The passenger's nationality was not listed. But the memo included one detail that made Eamon's skin crawl. Subject matches description provided in communique from Allied intelligence dated May 2nd, forwarded via diplomatic channels. What communique? What description? May 2nd was 2 days after Hitler's supposed death, the same day the Soviets announced they'd captured Berlin and found his body. Eamon searched for weeks but found nothing more. If such a document existed, if Allied intelligence had circulated a description of someone they were looking for, it had been removed from the files or never archived in the first place. But the reference existed, buried in an obscure naval memo that no one had thought to classify, because no one had connected it to anything significant. But Eamon was connecting it now. A priority passenger leaving Italy in early May. A U-boat arriving in Argentina in July with an unmanifested passenger. A passenger who matched a description from Allied intelligence dated just after Hitler's reported death. The pattern was there, if you knew to look for it. One thing particularly interested Eamon about the U-boat story. Both submarines that arrived in Argentina had been fitted with schnorkel systems, a German innovation that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This technology extended their range dramatically and allowed them to cross the Atlantic without surfacing, making them nearly invisible to Allied patrols. If you wanted to transport someone across the Atlantic in secret, a schnorkel-equipped U-boat would be the perfect vehicle. Invisible, self-contained, able to stay submerged for weeks at a time. The passenger would be uncomfortable, certainly, living in the cramped conditions of a submarine for 2 months, but alive and undiscovered. Eamon found one more detail that seemed significant. U-530's commander, Otto Wehrmuth, had refused to explain their mission even under interrogation. Years later, after being allowed to settle in Argentina, Wehrmuth gave a single interview to a German-language newspaper in Buenos Aires. In that interview he made a strange comment. "We carried out our final orders to the letter. What those orders were, I will take to my grave." Wehrmuth died in 1976. Whatever he knew, he kept his word. The implication was clear. Someone important had arrived in Argentina on a U-boat in July 1945. Someone the Argentine government was expecting. someone they were prepared to protect, someone whose presence was so sensitive that all records had to be suppressed. But who could be that important? Who could command such resources, such loyalty, such elaborate arrangements? Eamon knew the answer. He just had to prove it. Act 3. Argentina's role. To understand why Argentina would shelter the most wanted man in the world, you had to understand Juan Domingo Perón and the unique political and social environment of Argentina in the immediate post-war years. Perón was Argentina's president from 1946 to 1955, and again from 1973 until his death in 1974. But in the immediate post-war years, he served as Secretary of Labour and Vice President under President Edelmiro Farrell, positions he used to implement what would become known in whispered conversations among intelligence agencies as his Nazi safe haven program. This wasn't a conspiracy theory or a matter of historical debate. Perón's government openly welcomed Nazi fugitives, though they denied the fugitives were war criminals and insisted they were simply German immigrants seeking a fresh start. Argentina issued thousands of landing permits to Germans, Austrians and Croatians with suspicious backgrounds and often with demonstrably false papers. The country became a refuge for war criminals, SS officers and high-ranking Nazi officials who feared prosecution at Nuremberg or by Soviet forces. Why would Argentina do this? Eamon found several intersecting reasons as he researched Perón's motivations. First, Perón admired European fascism and saw it as a model for his own political movement, which he called justicialism, but which bore strong resemblances to Italian fascism in its corporatist structure and cult of personality. Perón had served as a military observer in Italy before the war and had been impressed by Mussolini's methods of social control and mass mobilization. Second, Argentina had a large German immigrant population, over 500,000 people by some estimates, and strong cultural ties to Germany. German Argentines were a prosperous and influential community, and they lobbied heavily for the government to help their countrymen escape what they characterized as Allied persecution. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Perón believed that bringing in German technical expertise, even if it meant harbouring war criminals, would help modernize Argentina's military and industrial sectors. He wanted scientists, engineers and military specialists who could help Argentina become a major power. The Nazi regime had developed advanced technology in rocketry, jet aircraft and other fields, and Perón wanted access to that knowledge. And fourth, Perón saw the incoming Cold War clearly. He believed that the West would eventually need allies who weren't squeamish about dealing with former Nazis, that anti-communism would trump concerns about war crimes. He was largely proven right. Within a few years, both the United States and Britain were recruiting former Nazi scientists and intelligence officers for their own purposes. The policy was so well known that Israeli intelligence services spent years tracking Nazi fugitives in Argentina. The Simon Wiesenthal Center documented hundreds of cases. Some Nazis lived under their own names, like Erich Priebke. Others used thin aliases but made no real effort to hide, like Adolf Eichmann, who was listed in the Buenos Aires phone book under his alias. They felt safe because they were safe. The Argentine government protected them, and local police forces were ordered not to cooperate with foreign investigators seeking war criminals. When Israeli agents kidnapped Eichmann in 1960, it caused a major diplomatic incident, with Argentina protesting the violation of its sovereignty, not because they cared about Eichmann, but because they'd promised protection to Nazi refugees, and the kidnapping made them look weak. Among the locations favoured by Nazi expatriates was the town of San Carlos de Bariloche, usually just called Bariloche, in Argentina's Patagonia region. Eamon travelled there in September, 3 weeks after finding the mysterious folder, and what he discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Bariloche sat nestled in the Andes foothills on the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi, one of Argentina's most beautiful natural settings. The town looked like it had been transplanted directly from Bavaria. The architecture was alpine, all wooden chalets and steep-pitched roofs designed for snow loads. The population was heavily German, with German language signs on shops and German cultural centres that were really social clubs for expatriates. The landscape was stunning, remote, and easy to defend, with only a few roads leading in and out through mountain passes that could be watched or blocked. It was the perfect place to disappear, and dozens of Nazi war criminals had done exactly that. Eamon spent days at the local historical society, which occupied a building that had once been a German social club. The staff were friendly, but became noticeably less so when Eamon explained his research interest. Bariloche had complicated feelings about its Nazi past. On one hand, it was documented history that couldn't be denied. On the other hand, it was bad for tourism and embarrassing for the current generation, who had nothing to do with harbouring war criminals, but bore the stigma anyway. The historical society's archives were incomplete, with notable gaps in documentation from the late 1940s and early 1950s. Building permits were missing. Property transfer records had disappeared. Immigration documentation that should have existed simply wasn't there. Someone, at some point, had cleaned the archives of anything too sensitive. But Eamon was persistent, and he found things that had been overlooked. One property in particular had always attracted attention. Inalco House. Also called Residencia Inalco, it had been built in 1943 by a German businessman named Jorge Antonio, though his actual nationality was disputed. The mansion was enormous by local standards, built on an isolated promontory on the shores of Lake Nahuel, surrounded by dense forest that made approach by land nearly impossible without being seen. It had its own dock, its own power generation from a small hydroelectric system, and walls thick enough to be called fortified. Erich Priebke, the SS captain, had lived nearby and was known to visit the property regularly. Other Nazi fugitives were rumoured to have stayed there over the years. Local residents remembered German men arriving by boat at odd hours, staying for days or weeks, then disappearing. But ownership records for Inalco House were deliberately obscured. The property changed hands multiple times, always to shell companies registered in Paraguay or Uruguay, or to foreign trusts that were impossible to trace. When Eamon travelled to see the property in person, he found it still standing but abandoned, falling into decay. The gates were chained shut, the windows broken, weeds growing up through cracks in the courtyard. A sign warned of structural instability and ordered trespassers away. But Eamon wasn't deterred. He returned at night, climbed the fence, and explored the property with a flashlight. What he found was extraordinary. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms leading to other rooms in a maze-like configuration. The furniture had long since been removed, but you could see where expensive fixtures had been torn out, where wallpaper had covered rooms that must have been luxurious. In the basement, he found evidence of sophisticated security, bars on windows that were already below ground level, reinforced doors, what appeared to be a panic room with walls thick enough to stop bullets. And he found something else, a hidden door behind a false wall in what appeared to have been a wine cellar. The door led to a narrow staircase going down, deeper into the earth. Eamon descended carefully, his flashlight beam bouncing off stone walls that wet moisture. At the bottom was a room, maybe 15 feet by 20, with no windows and only the single entrance. The walls were covered with remnants of soundproofing material, rotting now but clearly visible. There were bolt holes in the floor where furniture had once been secured, and on one wall, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were German words. Wo ist meine Rettung? Where is my rescue? Eamon photographed everything, his heart pounding. This was a cell or a hiding place, or both. A room designed to keep someone concealed deep underground where they couldn't be found by search parties or satellite surveillance. A room where someone had waited, perhaps for years, living in isolation while the world above forgot they existed. He climbed back up and searched the rest of the house more carefully. In what must have been an office, he found something even more significant. Architectural blueprints rolled up and forgotten in a closet. The blueprints, dated 1947 and labelled "Renovations and Security Upgrades," showed the house's floor plan. On the official blueprints filed with the municipality, there was a standard basement. But someone had made handwritten notations in the margins of these copies, in German, referencing a gesicherte Unterebene, secured sublevel, that wasn't shown in the official plans. One notation, written in faded pencil and barely legible, read, "Geschützter Gast, 48 bis 54. Protected Guest, 48 to 54, 1948 to 1954, a 6-year period when someone requiring protection lived in a secret basement beneath a mansion in Bariloche, Argentina." Eamon carefully rolled up the blueprints and took them with him. This was evidence, real evidence, that someone of importance had been hidden in this house during those years. But who? The notation said "protected guest," which could mean anyone, except combined with everything else he had found, the pattern was impossible to ignore. As he climbed back over the fence and walked to his rental car, Eamon didn't notice the vehicle parked down the road with its lights off, didn't see the 2 men inside watching him with night vision equipment, didn't realise that his investigation had just triggered alarms in circles that still, decades later, wanted certain secrets to remain buried. But he was about to find out. A-Seat 4, the witnesses who never spoke. Finding documentary evidence was one thing. Finding witnesses was another, and infinitely more challenging. By 2019, 74 years after the war's end, almost everyone who could have known the truth was dead. The generation that lived through the 1940s was gone, taking their secrets with them. But Eamon discovered that a few people had left behind statements, testimonies, and deathbed confessions that were either ignored or suppressed at the time, dismissed as the confused memories of the elderly, or the attention-seeking lies of people trying to make themselves seem important. The first was Adelheid Schultz, and her story consumed weeks of Eamon's investigation. Schultz was a German nurse who had worked with the SS Medical Corps during the war, stationed at various locations, including a field hospital on the Eastern Front. She was 36 years old when the war ended, and like many Germans with compromising pasts, she fled to South America rather than face denazification proceedings in occupied Germany. She arrived in Argentina in 1947 and settled in Bariloche, where she ran a small clinic serving the local German community. By all accounts, she was a skilled nurse and well-liked, though she rarely spoke about her past. She died in 1968 at the age of 62 from cancer, and it was only in her final days that she made statements that should have attracted more attention. Before she died, Schultz met with a Catholic priest, Father Miguel Serrano, to make her final confession. Serrano was an elderly Spanish priest who served Bariloche's small Catholic community, and who had a reputation for being discreet and understanding with his German parishioners, many of whom carried guilt for their wartime activities. Serrano kept written records of significant confessions, a practice that was technically against church doctrine, but not uncommon among older priests who wanted to document potential historical importance or who felt certain truths needed to be preserved. His journals were extensive, covering decades of service, and they'd been stored in the church basement after his death in 1993. Eamon found these journals during his time in Bariloche, guided there by Carlos Villanueva, whose grandfather had rented the house to Hans Bauer. Carlos mentioned that his grandmother had been friends with Adelheid Schultz, and that Schultz had made some kind of dramatic confession before dying. Carlos suggested the priest's journals might still exist somewhere. It took Eamon days of searching church records and speaking with elderly parishioners before he found the journals in a damp basement room filled with the old records. Most were mundane, recording baptisms, marriages, confessions of ordinary sins, but the entry dated October 7th, 1968, 2 days before Schultz's death, was extraordinary. Eamon photographed the entire entry, written in Father Serrano's careful handwriting. Adelheid Schultz came to me today for what I believe will be her final confession. She is dying, in great pain but also in great distress, about events she has kept secret for many years. I have never recorded specific confessions before, but I believe this testimony is of historical significance and may need to be known after her death. Adelheid confessed to providing medical care for a man she identified as the man with the moustache, a phrase she used repeatedly and that I understood to refer to Adolf Hitler, former leader of the German Reich. She said he lived under protection in the Bariloche area from 48 until the mid-50s, though she was uncertain of exact dates as she was instructed never to write anything down or keep records. She described providing treatment for various ailments. The man suffered from Parkinson's symptoms, tremors in his left hand that worsened over the years she treated him. He had chronic digestive issues, severe enough that he followed a strict vegetarian diet. He suffered from chronic anxiety and insomnia, requiring medication that Adelaide had to obtain through connections to doctors in Buenos Aires, who did not question what the prescriptions were for. She said he rarely left the property where he stayed, which she described as a house on the lake with many rooms underground. She was brought there by car with covered windows so she could not identify the exact location, though she believed it was within an hour's drive of Bariloche. The man was guarded by former SS men, whom she recognised by their bearing, and occasionally by actual recognition of their faces from her time with the medical corps. She said the man was unmistakably the Führer, despite being aged and weakened. She described his moustache, his eyes, his manner of speaking, all matching her memories of newsreels and photographs. He spoke to her only in German, sometimes rambled about the war and how history would vindicate him, sometimes sat in silence for entire sessions staring at the mountains visible through a window. When I asked why she was revealing this now, Adelheid said, "Because he's dead. They're all dead or dying. The guards, the ones who arranged everything, even the president who protected them. And someone should know the truth before we're all gone, and it becomes just another legend that no one can prove. I know what I saw, I know who I treated, and I want God to forgive me for keeping it secret. But I was afraid for my family, afraid of what they would do if I spoke." She died 2 days later. I do not know if her testimony is true, but I believe she believed it was true. Whether it was truth or the confused memories of a dying woman, I cannot say, but I've recorded it here as she told it to me. Eamon read the entry 3 times, his hands shaking. This was testimony, direct testimony, from someone who claimed to have treated Hitler in Argentina. Skeptics would dismiss it as unreliable. The memories of a dying woman, possibly confused or delusional. But the details were so specific, the medical descriptions so precise, that it was hard to dismiss entirely. And there was something about the way Father Serrano had recorded it, noting his own skepticism, but still finding it significant enough to document, that gave it weight. But one witness, even a detailed testimony, wasn't enough. Eamon needed more, and he found it in an unlikely place: the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had investigated claims that Hitler escaped to South America. This wasn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It was documented fact, available to anyone who filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the relevant files. In 2014, the FBI released hundreds of pages of declassified documents showing that agents had followed up on numerous reports of Hitler sightings in Argentina throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Eamon obtained these files and spent days reading through them in his Buenos Aires apartment. Most of the reports were clearly false, obviously mistaken identity or deliberate hoaxes. People saw men with moustaches and reported them as Hitler, or people who disliked their German neighbours made anonymous tips hoping to cause trouble. But some reports were disturbingly specific and came from credible witnesses. One file documented the testimony of a former German naval officer named Helmuth Greiner, who was living in Buenos Aires in 1947. Greiner contacted the FBI's legal attaché in Buenos Aires and claimed to have seen Hitler at a remote estate near Bariloche. Drina provided physical descriptions that matched Hitler, details about security arrangements including armed guards and restricted access, and even sketched a map of the property showing a large house on a promontory overlooking a lake. FBI agents investigated but concluded the lead was unverifiable. Reading between the lines of the report, Eamon could see that the agents had tried to visit the property Greiner described, but were turned away by Argentine authorities who claimed it was private property belonging to a diplomat and thus not subject to search. The FBI had no jurisdiction in Argentina and couldn't pursue it further. Another file documented testimony from an Argentine businesswoman named Isabella Ruiz, who reported in 1951 that she had met someone who looked exactly like the former German leader at a private party in San Carlos de Bariloche. The party was held at the German Cultural Centre, attended by perhaps 40 people, mostly wealthy German expatriates. Ruiz was there as the guest of a German businessman she was dating. She described the man as being in his 60s, with a distinctive moustache, deep-set eyes, and an authoritative manner despite appearing ill. He spoke German and was accompanied by two younger men who she assumed were relatives or caretakers, but who watched the room constantly like bodyguards. He was introduced only as Hans, with no last name given. Ruiz said the other Germans at the party treated him with unusual deference, almost reverence, in a way that struck her as odd. The FBI files show that agents had interviewed Ruiz and found her credible, noting she had no reason to fabricate such a story, and was actually reluctant to come forward because she feared damaging her relationship with the German community where she did business. But again, the investigation hit a dead end when Argentine authorities declined to cooperate in identifying the man Ruiz described. There were dozens of similar reports, each individually unverifiable, but collectively painting a picture of someone matching Hitler's description, living in the Bariloche area, under protection during the late 1940s and early 50s. The FBI files showed these investigations were taken seriously, at least initially. But by the mid-1950s, the Bureau seemed to lose interest. The official conclusion was that Hitler had died in Berlin, and that the sightings were cases of mistaken identity, deliberate hoaxes, or the delusions of people who wanted to believe Hitler had escaped. But when Eamon obtained the files through his university's legal department using FOIA requests, he noticed something disturbing. Several pages had sections that were not just redacted with black marks, which was normal for declassified documents where names or sensitive information needed to be protected, but physically cut out of the documents before they were scanned. Entire paragraphs had been removed with scissors or a razor blade, leaving rectangular holes in the pages. This wasn't standard declassification procedure. This was destruction of evidence. Someone had gone through these files before they were scanned and released and had physically removed specific information. What had those sections contained? What information was so sensitive that it had to be physically destroyed rather than simply redacted with black ink like everything else? Eamon would never know. But the pattern was clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove specific details from these files. Details that might have proven that witnesses had described a man matching Hitler's exact physical description, living in Argentina, years after his supposed death. And there was one more witness, perhaps the most disturbing of all, Carlos Villanueva, whose grandfather had rented the house to Hans Bauer, agreed to speak with Eamon at length about what his grandfather had said over the years. They met at Carlos's home in Bariloche, a comfortable house filled with family photographs spanning generations. Carlos was 74, a retired schoolteacher with clear memories of his grandfather, who had died when Carlos was 20. His grandfather, Enrique Villanueva, had owned several rental properties in the Bariloche area and had been relatively wealthy by local standards. Mi abuela rented to many Germans, Carlos explained in Spanish as Eamon recorded the conversation. After the war, there were so many coming here. Some were just regular people looking for a fresh start, but some, everyone knew they were former Nazis. No one talked about it. It was just understood. You didn't ask questions about what they did in the war. Carlos described how his grandfather had rented a house on the outskirts of town to a man named Hans Bauer in 1947. Bauer paid 6 months' rent in advance, always in cash, always exact amounts. He rarely came to town. When he did, he wore a wide-brimmed hat and dark glasses even on overcast days. My abuelo said the German in the lake house never aged, Carlos told Eamon. He looked 60 years old in 1947 when he moved in, and he still looks 60 in 1954 when he left. My abuelo joked that maybe he had good genes or maybe he was sick and that's why his face looked like that. But he always said there was something off about the man. Carlos pulled out an old photograph from a box of family pictures. It showed his grandfather standing in front of a small house surrounded by trees, taken sometime in the 1950s based on the style and quality. Carlos pointed to a figure barely visible in the background, standing in the doorway of the house. That's the house he rented to Bauer, Carlos said, and that's Bauer in the door. My abuelo took this picture for property records, and he didn't realise until he developed it that Bauer was standing there. Eamon leaned close to examine the photograph. The figure was distant, features not entirely clear, but you could make out a man in dark clothing, a certain posture, and yes, what might be a moustache. "Can I photograph this?" Eamon asked. Carlos hesitated. "My family doesn't like to talk about this. When I was young, my mother told me never to mention the German renter. She said it could cause trouble for the family, but everyone involved is dead now. Maybe it's time the truth came out, whatever that truth is." Carlos let Eamon photograph the picture, and also shared more details about Hans Bauer's time in the house. The house was isolated, accessible only by a dirt road that was barely maintained. Bauer always had at least 2 other men living with him, younger men who Carlos's grandfather described as strong like soldiers. They would come to town occasionally to buy supplies, always paying cash, never engaging in conversation beyond necessary exchanges. Local people noticed the house because it didn't fit the pattern of other German expatriate homes. Most Germans in Bariloche were social, joining clubs, attending church, building community. But Bauer and his household were completely isolated, never attending events, never joining organisations, maintaining no social connections. There was another strange thing, Carlos said. Sometimes there would be visitors. Cars would arrive late at night, expensive cars from Buenos Aires based on the plates. Men in suits would go into the house and stay for hours, then leave before dawn. My abuelo saw this a few times when he would go fishing early in the morning and his route took him past the property. "Did your grandfather ever talk to these visitors?" Eamon asked. "No. He said they were government men, and you didn't ask government men questions if you knew what was good for you." Hans Bauer left the property abruptly in August 1954. He paid 6 months' rent in advance, in cash as always, and told Carlos's grandfather he would be relocating but provided no forwarding address. The house was left empty, and when the landlord finally entered it weeks later, he found it had been meticulously cleaned. Not a single personal item remained. Every surface had been scrubbed. The fireplace had been cleaned out so thoroughly that there wasn't even ash remaining. It was like he'd never been there, Carlos said. Except my abuelo found one thing. In a crack in the basement floor, someone had hidden a small piece of paper, folded many times to make it tiny. The paper had a German phrase written on it. Sie werden nie die Wahrheit erfahren. They will never know the truth. Act 5. The identity switch. One of the most persistent questions about Hitler's alleged survival was simple but fundamental. If he didn't die in the bunker, whose body did the Soviets find? If the remains in the garden were not Hitler's, then whose were they? And how did they come to be identified as the Führer's? The answer might lie in one of the Third Reich's most disturbing programs, one that was historically documented and that created possibilities that seemed like something out of a spy thriller, but were actually real. The use of body doubles. Hitler had long been paranoid about assassination. This paranoia was not unfounded. There were numerous documented attempts on his life throughout his time in power, including the famous July 20th, 1944 bomb plot that nearly killed him. Throughout the war, he employed several men who resembled him physically, and were trained to mimic his mannerisms, speech patterns and appearance. These doubles would occasionally appear at public events or travel in his motorcade to confuse potential assassins. The existence of these doubles was not secret. They were photographed, documented by the Gestapo, and well known to Allied intelligence. One of the most famous was Gustav Wehler, a German soldier who bore a striking resemblance to Hitler and was photographed by Soviet forces after the fall of Berlin. Wehler's fate after the war was unclear, and some theories suggested he might have been one of the bodies found in the bunker complex. Eamon spent days researching the double program and found it more extensive than he'd realised. The SS had maintained files on men throughout Germany who resembled Hitler, cataloguing them as potential replacements for public appearances. Some knew they were being considered as doubles. Others had no idea their photographs were in Gestapo files marked Führer Resemblance Program. Could one of these doubles have been the burned body in the bunker garden? It was possible, even plausible. The remains were badly charred, making visual identification impossible. The Soviets relied on dental records, but those records were problematic from the start, and became more problematic the more Eamon researched them. Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blaschke, was captured by the Americans, not the Soviets, which meant the Russians had to rely on secondary sources for dental information. Blaschke's assistant, Käthe Häusermann, who had more direct knowledge of Hitler's dental work, was captured by Soviet investigators and interrogated for weeks. She identified bridgework and dental structures that she said belonged to Hitler. But Häusermann was held in Soviet captivity for years, imprisoned without trial, interrogated repeatedly, sometimes under duress. Years later, after her release in the mid-1950s, she made statements suggesting she had been pressured to confirm identifications she wasn't entirely certain about. In interviews late in her life, she admitted that the pressure to provide definitive answers had been intense, and that she'd been shown dental remains under conditions that made careful analysis difficult. And there was another problem, one that nagged at historians who looked closely at the evidence. The dental reports changed over time. The first Soviet report on Hitler's remains, issued in May 1945, just days after the bunker was captured, described one set of dental features. A second report from 1946 described different features, including dental work that didn't match the initial descriptions. A third report from 1968, when the Soviets finally admitted publicly that they had Hitler's remains, described yet another set of features. How could the same body have three different sets of dental characteristics? The only explanations were that the Soviets had mixed up multiple sets of remains, that they were lying about what they had found, or that different investigators had examined different bodies thinking they were all Hitler. None of these explanations inspired confidence in the official Soviet account. Eamon found a possible answer in the diary of a German dentist named Klaus Richter. Richter had practiced in Berlin during the war and fled to Argentina in 1947, part of the wave of Germans escaping Allied occupation. He died in Cordoba in 1983 at the age of 74, and his diary was donated to a local historical society by his daughter, who thought it might have value as a primary source document about life in wartime Berlin. Most of the diary was unremarkable, day-to-day accounts of his dental practice, complaints about shortages of materials, descriptions of air raids, and the growing sense of doom as the Red Army approached. But one entry, dated April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's supposed death, was extraordinary. Richter wrote, "Visited today by 2 SS officers, Sturmbannführer rank, names not given. They brought with them a man, unconscious, who bore remarkable resemblance to the Führer. They explained that this man had been injured in an air raid and required emergency dental work. They showed me dental records and x-rays, and instructed me to make this man's dental work match those records exactly. I protested that this was unethical, that modifying a man's teeth to match someone else's records was fraud and potentially dangerous to the patient. The officers became threatening. They implied that refusal would result in consequences for myself and my family. They said this was a matter of higher state security and that I would understand later why it was necessary. I refused. I told them I would not participate in whatever deception they were planning. The officers became angry but eventually left, taking the unconscious man with them. I do not know what became of him, or whether they found another dentist willing to do what I refused. I fear what this means. If they are creating a body double with matching dental records, it can only be for the purpose of deception at the highest level. I must leave Berlin immediately. Richter's entry ended there. The next entry was dated May 5th, describing his escape from Berlin in the chaos of the Soviet occupation. The entry raised a horrifying possibility. What if the dental work the Soviets found wasn't Hitler's at all, but modifications made to a double's teeth to match Hitler's records? What if someone else died in that bunker, either willingly as a final service to the Führer or unwillingly as a sacrificial offering to create the illusion of Hitler's death? It sounded like something out of a thriller novel, like a plot too elaborate to be real. But in the chaos of Berlin's final days, with SS officers desperate to help their leader escape, with the resources of an entire state apparatus at their disposal, even as that state collapsed, would such a plan have been beyond possibility? Eamon didn't know, but the more he researched, the more he realised that the physical evidence for Hitler's death was far weaker than most people assumed. The dental records were contradictory and based on testimony from people under Soviet control. The skull fragment that supposedly proved the case turned out to belong to a woman. The eyewitness testimony came from a handful of people who were in the bunker under tremendous stress and who gave conflicting accounts. There was no definitive proof. There was only a story that everyone accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to consider, and because reopening the question would mean admitting that one of history's most important moments might be based on a lie. But what if it was a lie? What if the body in the garden was a double, carefully prepared with matching dental work, burned beyond recognition, and presented to the Soviets as Adolf Hitler? What if the real Hitler had slipped away in the chaos, hidden in a vehicle or led through the bunker's labyrinthine passages to an exit no one was watching? It was possible. Not certain, not proven, but possible. And that possibility, combined with everything else Eamon had found, made the scenario of escape seem less like fantasy and more like plausible alternative history. Act 6. The final years. If Hitler had escaped to Argentina, what happened to him there? How long did he live? Where did he ultimately die? And why did no one ever find him? These questions drove Eamon's investigation into its final, most dangerous phase. Because what he was about to discover would put him in the crosshairs of people who had spent decades ensuring these secrets stayed buried. The man known in Bariloche as Hans Bauer had lived in the rented house from 1947 to 1954, but his story didn't end when he left that property. Eamon began tracing what happened next, using property records, immigration documents, and interviews with elderly residents who remembered the German community from that era. 1954 was a significant year in Argentine history. Juan Perón's government was beginning to collapse. Political opposition was mounting, and the military was growing restless with Perón's increasingly authoritarian rule and erratic economic policies. By September 1955, Perón would be overthrown in a military coup and forced into exile. Many of the Nazis living under Perón's protection fled during this period, either deeper into Patagonia, to Paraguay, or to other countries. They recognized that whoever came after Perón might not be as friendly to their presence, might even cooperate with international efforts to prosecute war criminals. Eamon found evidence that Hans Bauer was part of this exodus. In the Argentine Interior Ministry archives, buried in a box of unsorted documents from the Perón era, was a transportation manifest dated August 19, 1954. The manifest listed special cargo, being moved via military helicopter from Bariloche to an unspecified location in Sector Andino Sur, the southern Andes sector. The manifest included no names, just reference numbers, but it noted maximum security protocol and priority 1 classification, and was signed by an Interior Ministry official who reported directly to Perón himself. Eamon cross-referenced the date with other documents and found something interesting. August 19th, 1954 was the same date as the memo he'd found earlier, the one that mentioned primary asset moved to Location Condor. Location Condor. Eamon had been trying to identify what that meant for weeks, and finally he found a clue in an unlikely source. A travel book about Patagonia published in 1962 by an Argentine outdoorsman named Roberto Sanchez. The book, Hidden Valleys of the Andes, was mostly about hiking trails and camping spots, but it included a curious section about places that were off-limits to travellers. One passage caught Eamon's attention. In the remote reaches of the southern Andes, there are valleys that appear on no maps and roads that lead to nowhere official. During my expeditions in the late 1950s, I heard rumours from local gauchos about a compound deep in what they called the Condor Valley, named for the large number of Andean condors that nested in the cliffs nearby. The gauchos said German men lived there in a fortified building, men who did not welcome visitors, and who had the protection of the military. I attempted to locate this valley during an expedition in 1960, but was turned back by an army patrol that claimed the area was restricted for military exercises. I have marked this region on my map with a question mark, as it remains one of Patagonia's unsolved mysteries. The book included hand-drawn maps. Eamon found the one showing the Condor Valley region, though Sanchez had admitted he'd never actually seen it. The location was deep in the Andes, at least 50 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by helicopter or by a treacherous mountain road that was impassable much of the year due to snow. Eamon tried to locate Condor Valley on modern satellite maps, but found nothing. The area was part of a national park, largely wilderness, with no roads or settlements visible from above. But the terrain was rugged enough that a compound hidden in a valley might not be visible from satellite imagery, especially if it had been built to be concealed. If Hans Bauer had been moved to Condor Valley in 1954, it would explain why sightings of him in Bariloche stopped after that date. It would explain why FBI investigations in the mid-50s had turned up nothing. He'd been moved to a location so remote that even if someone knew generally where to look, finding him would be nearly impossible. But how long had he stayed there? And when did he finally die? Eamon found hints of the answer in an unexpected place. Among the documents he'd photographed from Father Serrano's journals was a mention of a request he'd received in February 1962. A man had come to the church in Bariloche, speaking German, asking for a priest willing to travel to a remote location to administer last rites to a dying man. Father Serrano had agreed, thinking it was a wealthy German landowner in an isolated estancia. He'd been picked up by car, driven for several hours with the windows covered so he couldn't identify the route, and brought to what he described as a monastery of German monks in the high mountains. The dying man, whom Father Serrano didn't name in his journal, was very old, very ill, and surrounded by men who were clearly guards rather than monks despite their religious robes. Father Serrano administered last rites, stayed for several hours while the man died, and was then driven back to Bariloche, again with covered windows. He noted that the experience had disturbed him, that something about the situation felt wrong, but he'd honoured his vows of confidentiality and never reported it to anyone. The entry was dated February 15th, 1962. This matched something Eamon would find later in the monastery, but we'll get to that. The pattern was becoming clearer. Hans Bauer, whoever he really was, had lived in Bariloche from 1947 to 1954 under the protection of Perón's government. When that protection became uncertain due to political instability, he'd been moved to a more secure location, the alleged Condor Valley compound, where he'd lived until at least 1962. If this man was Hitler, and Eamon was increasingly convinced he was, then he'd survived in hiding for 17 years after his supposed death. 17 years watching the world move on, watching Germany be divided and rebuilt, watching the Holocaust's full horror be revealed at Nuremberg, watching new wars and new crises replace the one he'd started. 17 years as a ghost, a man who was supposed to be dead, living in silent isolation while history forgot him. And then, in 1962, at approximately age 73, he'd finally died. Not in glory, not in battle, not in any way that matched his grandiose vision of destiny, but quietly, in a monastery in the mountains, attended by a priest who didn't even know who he was giving last rites to. If Eamon was right, it was a pathetic end for a man who'd nearly conquered Europe, but it would also mean that one of history's greatest monsters had escaped justice, had lived in comfortable exile while his victims could never escape the consequences of his actions. The thought made Eamon angry. If this was true, if Hitler had escaped, then the entire post-war narrative was built on a lie. Justice had not been served. Evil had not been punished. The monster had gotten away. And that meant someone needed to know the truth, no matter how disturbing it was. Act 7. The cover-up. The deeper Eamon dug, the more resistance he encountered. And not just from the distant past, not just from sealed archives and missing documents, from the present, from people who were watching him, following him, warning him to stop. It started small. Documents that should have been available in the Buenos Aires archives were suddenly checked out or misplaced when Eamon requested them. Archive clerks who had been helpful became evasive, unable to meet his eyes. One clerk, an older woman named Maria, who'd helped him find several key documents, pulled him aside one afternoon and whispered urgently, "Stop asking about the Germans. Someone came here yesterday asking about you, asking what you've been researching. They showed government identification but wouldn't say which agency. They requested copies of all your document requests. I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you should be careful." Then his apartment in Buenos Aires was broken into. Nothing was stolen, which somehow made it worse than if it had been a normal burglary. His laptop was still there, his camera, his wallet with cash in it. But his papers had been disturbed, carefully rifled through. His research notes had been photographed. He could tell because they weren't quite in the same order he had left them. And on his desk, someone had left a photocopy of his passport photo, with a red X drawn through his face. The message was clear. We know who you are, we know what you're researching, and we can get to you whenever we want. Eamon reported it to the police, but they were dismissive. Nothing stolen, no visible damage, probably just kids looking for money and leaving when they didn't find any. The officer taking his report didn't even seem interested in the marked passport copy, suggesting Eamon had done it himself for attention. Then the warnings became explicit. He received an email from an anonymous account, no profile information, sent through an encrypted service that made tracing impossible. The message was simple. Stop reading. Some ghosts are meant to stay buried. He reported it to local police, who told him it was probably a prank from someone who'd seen his academic profile online. But Eamon knew better. Someone was threatened by his investigation, and that someone had resources. He began to wonder if the cover-up, if that's what it was, extended beyond Argentina. Had other governments been involved in hiding the truth? Had there been an international decision to let certain secrets remain secret? The answer, he discovered, was almost certainly yes. In the declassified CIA files released in the 1990s and 2000s, files that Eamon obtained through academic channels and FOIA requests, there were scattered references to Nazi fugitives in South America. The CIA had monitored these men, tracked their movements, and in some cases even recruited them for intelligence work during the Cold War. Nazi scientists had been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, a program that recruited German technical experts despite their wartime activities. The rationale was simple. If America didn't take them, the Soviets would. Morality took a back seat to Cold War competition. But the CIA's interest in Nazi fugitives seemed to end in the late 1950s, at least officially. After that, the agency's position was simple. These men were no longer a priority. The Cold War took precedence. Maintaining good relations with South American governments was more important than pursuing aging war criminals. Eamon found a memo from 1958 that made this policy explicit. The memo, written by a CIA station chief in Buenos Aires and addressed to CIA headquarters in Langley, recommended that termination of search efforts for remaining high-value Nazi targets be implemented. The reason given was brutally frank. South American stability takes priority over historical accountability. Continue monitoring but cease active investigation. In other words, the CIA knew there were still Nazi fugitives in Argentina, but pursuing them risked destabilizing governments that the United States needed as allies against communism. So the agency decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Could Hitler have been one of those sleeping dogs? Could the CIA have known he was alive and decided that the diplomatic complications of revealing it outweighed the value of bringing him to justice? It seemed impossible. The death of Adolf Hitler was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Surely the CIA, MI6 and other intelligence agencies would have moved heaven and earth to confirm it or expose a hoax. But maybe not. Maybe, in the chaos of the Cold War's early years, with the Soviet Union emerging as the new existential threat, pursuing an aging, powerless fugitive in a remote corner of Argentina wasn't worth the diplomatic complications. Maybe they'd even seen value in Hitler remaining dead, in maintaining the narrative of justice served and evil punished, because reopening that question would undermine confidence in the post-war order. Eamon couldn't prove any of this, but the pattern of missing documents, sealed files and evasive official responses suggested something had been hidden. Not necessarily by one government or one agency, but by a collective decision across multiple nations to let certain truths remain buried. And someone, even now, 74 years after Hitler's supposed death, wanted to keep it that way. The surveillance became more obvious. Eamon noticed the same car parked near his apartment building multiple days in a row. 2 men sitting inside, not even trying to hide. When he went to the university library, the same men were there, sitting at different tables but always watching. He started taking precautions. He made copies of all his research, storing them in multiple locations, uploading encrypted files to cloud storage, mailing physical copies to trusted colleagues abroad. If something happened to him, he wanted the information to survive. His thesis advisor at the university called him in for a meeting. The conversation was uncomfortable from the start. Eamon, there have been complaints, concerns about the university's reputation. Some of your research requests have attracted attention from people who are influential with our funding sources. Influential how? Eamon asked. I can't say specifically, but I've been advised to suggest that perhaps you should consider focusing on a different topic, something less controversial, something that won't raise questions about the university's judgment in supporting your work. Are you telling me to stop my research? I'm telling you that your current line of inquiry is making people nervous. People who have the power to make life difficult for this program and for you personally. I'm advising you, as someone who cares about your future, to consider whether pursuing this topic is worth the consequences. It was a threat, politely worded but unmistakable. Continue investigating and face professional consequences. Drop it and your academic career continues normally. Eamon realised that his investigation had reached a point where powerful people, whoever they were, wanted him to stop. They tried subtle warnings. They tried breaking into his apartment. Now they were applying institutional pressure. But he was too close to quit. He had one more lead to follow, one more place to search. If he was going to be forced to stop, he wanted to find the final piece of evidence first. The monastery of San Juan de la Cruz. Father Serrano's journals had mentioned it. Carlos Villanueva had said his grandfather spoke of monks keeping German secrets. and Eamon had found a reference in Argentine church records to a Benedictine monastery in the southern Andes that had been founded by German monks in the 1920s and that had remained closed to visitors for decades. If the protected guest had been moved from Condor Valley to a more secure location as he aged and became ill, a monastery would be perfect. Isolated, self-contained, protected by religious privilege, and staffed by people loyal to a shared ethnic and possibly ideological background. Eamon knew it was a risk. If the surveillance was as serious as it seemed, going to the monastery would make him vulnerable. But he'd come this far. He couldn't stop now. He made arrangements to visit, claiming to be researching Catholic missions in Patagonia for his dissertation. And on a cool morning in late October, he drove into the mountains, following directions that took him further from civilization with every kilometre. What he found there would either vindicate everything he believed or prove he'd been chasing shadows. But either way, he was about to reach the end of his investigation. Because the people watching him had decided that the monastery was where his investigation would end, one way or another. Ending. The truth he cannot prove. The monastery of San Juan de la Cruz sat at the end of a winding mountain road, 3 hours from Bariloche, surrounded by pine forest and snow-capped peaks that rose like ancient sentinels into the pale sky. The road itself was barely maintained, more gravel and dirt than pavement, climbing through switchbacks that offered dizzying views of valleys dropping away thousands of feet below. Eamon drove slowly, his rental car struggling with the altitude and the grade. He passed no other vehicles, saw no signs of human habitation beyond the road itself, which looked like it was used rarely enough that grass grew in patches where the gravel had worn thin. The monastery appeared suddenly around a final curve. It was a stone building in the German style, almost like a small castle, with thick walls and narrow windows that suggested it had been built as much for defence as for prayer. A cross rose from a tower at one end, and smoke drifted from chimneys, the only sign of life. Eamon parked in a small courtyard and sat for a moment, his heart pounding. This was it. Whatever truth existed, it was here. He could feel it with a certainty that transcended logic. He got out of the car and approached the heavy wooden door. Before he could knock, it opened, and an elderly monk in traditional robes regarded him with eyes that were simultaneously kind and sad. "You're the researcher, yes? The one studying Catholic missions?" The monk spoke Spanish with a German accent. "Yes, I'm Eamon Weiss. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, brother. Brother Klaus, please come in. We have been expecting you." The phrase sent a chill through Eamon. We have been expecting you. Not I, but we. As if his arrival was anticipated, as if preparations had been made. Brother Klaus led him through stone corridors lit by bare bulbs hanging from ancient fixtures. The monastery was old but maintained, with that particular quality of cleanliness and order that came from religious discipline. They passed a small chapel where several monks knelt in prayer, their murmured Latin echoing off stone walls. "You're interested in our history?" Brother Klaus asked as they walked. "Yes, the founding of German monasteries in Argentina, the role they played in the post-war period." Brother Klaus nodded slowly. "The post-war period. Yes, that is a complicated time. Many Germans came here seeking peace, seeking to escape the chaos of occupied Europe. We welcomed them. That is the Christian way, to offer sanctuary to those who seek it, even if they were fleeing justice rather than chaos." The monk stopped and turned to face Eamon. His expression was unreadable. "That is a question of perspective, young man. Who defines justice? The victors of a war? God? Each man's conscience? We welcome those who came to us in need. What they had done before, that was between them and God." Brother Klaus continued walking, leading Eamon to a small library where shelves held books in German, Latin and Spanish. "Our monastery keeps extensive records. Perhaps you would like to see them." "I would. Thank you." "Please, wait here. I will bring what you need." The monk left, and Eamon found himself alone in the library. He looked around at the books, noting religious texts but also historical works, biographies of German leaders, books about the Third Reich written in German. The collection suggested these monks maintained an interest in their homeland's history even in exile. Brother Klaus returned with a folder of documents. These are records from our founding through the 1960s. Baptisms, deaths, visitors we received. Perhaps they will be useful for your research. Eamon began looking through the folder, seeing exactly what Brother Klaus had described. Mundane records of monastery life. He was about to thank the monk and ask if there were other archives when he noticed something odd about the folder itself. It was the right size for what it contained, but when he felt the bottom, there was a slight irregularity, as if something was hidden underneath the visible documents. He looked at Brother Klaus, who was watching him with that same expression of kindness mixed with sadness. Brother Klaus, I'm not really here to research Catholic missions. I think you know that. The monk was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suspected as much. Your questions were too specific, too focused. You are seeking something else. I'm seeking the truth about what happened here, about who was protected here. Brother Klaus sat down heavily in a chair, suddenly looking his full age, which Eamon guessed was well into his 80s. I have prayed for guidance about what to do when someone like you came, because I knew eventually someone would. The truth cannot stay buried forever, no matter how many people wish it would. Then you'll help me? I will show you what exists, but I cannot protect you from the consequences of knowing. There are those who believe some truths are too dangerous, too destabilizing. They have protected these secrets for a very long time, and they will not be happy that the secrets are revealed. I understand the risk. Brother Klaus looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision. Come with me. What you seek is not in this library. It is below. He led Eamon down a narrow stone staircase into the monastery cellar, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as they descended, and Eamon could smell the earth, damp stone, the scent of age. At the bottom was a single room, lined with shelves holding boxes of documents. Brother Klaus walked directly to one shelf and pulled down a box marked 1947 bis 1965, 1947 to 1965. This box contains records that were never supposed to be kept, Brother Klaus said. But Brother Heinrich, who was our abbot during those years, believed that history must be documented even when that documentation is dangerous. He kept these records in secret, and only a few of us knew they existed. He handed the box to Eamon. I must pray now. I will leave you here to examine these documents. Take what time you need. Brother Klaus, why are you showing me this? Why not destroy it or keep it hidden? The old monk smiled sadly. Because I'm 86 years old, and when I die, which will be soon, these records will disappear. The other monks who knew about them are all dead now. I am the last. And I have decided that whatever sins were committed by keeping these secrets, they should not continue beyond my generation. The truth should be known, whatever consequences follow. God will judge whether I am right. He left Eamon alone in the cellar, and Eamon opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were records, written in neat German script by Brother Heinrich over many years. Eamon read through them, his heart pounding harder with each page. The records documented the arrival at the monastery in August 1954 of a man described only as guest of protection, transferred from southern location by authority of Interior Ministry. The guest was elderly, in poor health, suffering from Parkinson's disease and severe anxiety. He was accompanied by two men identified only as guardians, and was to be housed in the monastery's secure wing, attended by the monks, but isolated from any outside contact. The records covered 8 years, from 1954 to 1962. They described the guest's declining health, his increasing paranoia, his moments of lucidity when he would speak about history and his role in it. Brother Heinrich's notes were clinical but occasionally editorial. The guest spoke today of his certainty that history would vindicate him, that future generations would understand he had been right. I did not have the heart to tell him that history has already judged him a monster. Perhaps God will offer him understanding that human justice cannot. The final entry was dated February 12th, 1962. The guest died today after 3 days of unconsciousness. Father Serrano from Bariloche came to administer last rites. We will bury him in the monastery cemetery under the name he'd been using. May God have mercy on his soul, for men will not. Beneath Brother Heinrich's records were the documents Eamon had been seeking. A passport, Argentine, issued in 1953 under the name Kurt Olden. The photo showed an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a thin moustache and deep-set eyes. The resemblance to Adolf Hitler was undeniable, even accounting for age and illness. Beneath the passport was a death certificate. Name, Kurt Olden. Date of death, February 12th, 1962. Course of death, cerebral hemorrhage. Place of death, San Juan de la Cruz Monastery. Attending physician, Brother Heinrich, trained medical practitioner. And finally, a photograph. It showed an elderly man sitting in a chair on a terrace, a blanket across his lap, looking out at a vista of mountains and lake. The mountains in the background were unmistakably the Andes. The lake was clearly Nahuel Huapi. The man in the photo looked frail and tired, but his face, even aged and weathered by years of illness, bore the features that billions of people around the world would instantly recognize. Eamon's hands trembled as he photographed everything with his phone, working quickly because he didn't know how much time he had. He photographed each page of Brother Heinrich's records, the passport from multiple angles, the death certificate, the photograph. The phone's camera shutter sound echoed in the stone cellar like a countdown. This was it. This was the proof. Not definitive, perhaps, because skeptics could always claim the documents were forged or the resemblance coincidental. But compelling enough to rewrite history, to force a re-examination of everything everyone thought they knew about how the war ended. He heard footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets of footsteps moving quickly. Brother Klaus appeared in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing stood behind him. The monk's face was pale, apologetic, frightened. "I'm sorry," Brother Klaus whispered. "I told them you were here. They called me last night and said that if you came to the monastery I was to notify them immediately. They said there would be consequences for the monastery if I did not comply. I am sorry. I am an old man and a coward. Please forgive me." The men moved quickly into the room. One of them grabbed Eamon's phone from his hands, checked the photos, and then smashed it on the stone floor with force that shattered it into pieces. The other seized the documents from Eamon's hands, the passport, the death certificate, the photograph, Brother Heinrich's records. "You've seen things you shouldn't have," one of the men said in Spanish, though his accent was strange, vaguely German, but not quite. "But you're going to forget what you saw. Do you understand?" Eamon's heart was pounding so hard he felt lightheaded. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man stepped closer. "My colleague and I work for people who have spent 74 years making sure certain truths stayed buried. Those people have resources you cannot imagine, connections you cannot fight. If you speak about this, if you try to publish anything, if you even tell your friends over drinks, you will disappear. Not killed. That would create questions, investigations, attention. Just gone. Disappeared. No one will ever find you. Your family will spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened. Do you understand?" "Yes," Eamon managed to say. "Good. You're a smart young man. You have a promising career ahead of you. Don't throw it away chasing ghosts that the world has forgotten. The war ended 74 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. It doesn't matter anymore." "But it does matter," Eamon said, finding his voice. "The truth matters. History matters. If he escaped, if Hitler lived while his victims couldn't, that matters." The man's expression didn't change. "No, it doesn't. Because even if you proved it, What would change? Would it bring back the dead? Would it provide justice? Or would it just destabilise the comfortable narratives that people have built their understanding of history on? Sometimes, he said quietly, the truth does more harm than good. Sometimes lies that bring peace are better than truths that bring chaos. He nodded to his colleague, who pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket. "What is that?" Eamon asked, fear flooding through him. "Nothing harmful. A sedative. You'll sleep for a few hours. When you wake up, you'll be in your apartment in Buenos Aires. Your rental car will be returned. Your belongings will be waiting for you. And you will forget about this investigation and go back to your normal academic work. Do you understand?" Eamon wanted to fight, to run, but the other man was holding his arm with a grip like iron. He felt the needle enter his vein, felt the cold rush of the drug entering his bloodstream. "Why?" he started to ask, but his tongue felt thick, his thoughts scattering like leaves in wind. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was one of the men speaking quietly to Brother Klaus. "The monastery's funding will continue. Your silence is appreciated. Destroy the remaining records in that box. This ends here." Then nothing. Eamon woke in his apartment. It was dark outside. His head throbbed. He was lying on his couch, fully dressed, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He sat up slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. The monastery, Brother Klaus, the documents, the men who took everything. He checked his pockets. His wallet was there. His keys. Everything normal except his phone was gone. On his coffee table was a new phone, identical model to his old one still in the packaging. A note was attached. "Your phone was damaged. Here is a replacement. We hope you will reconsider your research focus." Eamon's laptop was open on his desk. He checked his research files. Most were still there, but the documents he'd scanned at the monastery were gone. His cloud storage backups had been wiped. The physical copies he had mailed to colleagues. He would find out later that they never arrived, lost somewhere in international mail. Everything was gone. Every photograph of the documents, every piece of evidence, vanished as thoroughly as if it had never existed. For weeks afterward, Eamon debated what to do. He could tell his story. He could go public with what he had seen. But without evidence, who would believe him? He'd be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, an academic whose research had driven him to seeing patterns where none existed. And there was the threat, explicit, credible. If he spoke out, he would disappear. He believed them. The men who took his evidence had resources and connections that made such a threat entirely plausible. His thesis advisor made it clear that any work on Nazi fugitives in Argentina would not be accepted. Choose a different topic, something less controversial, something that doesn't make enemies of powerful people. Eamon changed his thesis topic to immigration policy in post-war Argentina, keeping it general, avoiding the sensitive areas. He finished his degree. He took a teaching position at a small college in New England. He lived a quiet life, but he never stopped thinking about what he had found. Years later, in 2022, sitting in his office at the college, he recorded his final thoughts on the investigation. He didn't intend to publish them, didn't intend to share them widely, but he needed to document what he'd found, needed to put it into words even if no one else would ever hear them. The recording was found after his death, on a hard drive in his desk drawer. History records Adolf Hitler dying in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. The Soviets found remains. The world moved on. The war ended. Justice, such as it was served. But the documents I found suggest another story. A story of escape routes and U-boats, of Vatican assistance and Argentine protection, of a man who lived in hiding for 17 years, guarded and sheltered by those who still believed in him. I cannot prove this story is true. The evidence was taken from me. The witnesses are dead. The files are sealed or destroyed. But I know what I saw. I know what I held in my hands in that monastery cellar. I know the details I read in Brother Heinrich's careful handwriting. I know the face in the photograph, aged but unmistakable, And I know that someone, even now, 3 years after I found those documents, wants that truth to stay buried. Maybe they're right. Maybe some ghosts should stay buried. Maybe the world is better off believing that evil ended when Berlin fell. Or maybe the truth matters, no matter how disturbing. Maybe we owe it to history to ask the uncomfortable questions, to challenge the accepted narrative, to consider the possibility that what we think we know is not the whole story. I'll never know for certain. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if the men who threatened me were protecting a real secret or just trying to suppress what they feared could be true. Wondering if Hitler really did escape, or if I saw what I wanted to see in documents that might have been elaborate forgeries planted to deceive researchers like me. And maybe someday someone else will find what I found. Someone braver than me. Someone who can bring the truth to light without fear of the consequences. Until then, the fourth exit remains a mystery. A door that might have existed, or might have been nothing more than desperate wishful thinking by men who couldn't accept that their Führer died like a coward in a concrete hole beneath a burning city. But I believe the door was real. I believe he walked through it, and I believe he lived long enough to see the world forget him, before finally dying in silence, far from the ruins he created. The recording ends there. Eamon Weiss never published his findings. He lived a quiet life, taught history to undergraduates, occasionally published minor papers on uncontroversial topics. He seemed content, or at least resigned. He died in March 2022 at the age of 43, from a sudden heart attack while jogging near his home. His doctor said it was unusual for someone his age and health, but heart attacks happen. There was no autopsy at the family's request, no investigation, just a death certificate and a quiet funeral. His files, what remained of them, were donated to his university's library as he'd specified in his will. But when researchers tried to access them, they found that most of the documents related to his time in Argentina were missing. The boxes were there, properly labelled, but when opened they contained only blank paper, thousands of blank sheets carefully stacked to give the impression of full document boxes. Someone had removed the contents and replaced them with blanks, recently based on the paper quality, perhaps after Eamon's death, perhaps shortly before. And the folder that started it all, the unmarked manila folder Eamon Weiss found in the Buenos Aires National Archives on that humid August afternoon in 2019. When another researcher requested it based on Eamon's citation notes, the archivist had no record of it. No catalogue number, no filing location, no record that it had ever existed. They suggested politely that perhaps Eamon had been mistaken about where he'd found it, or that he'd misremembered the contents. It was gone. No trace remained. The archivist had no explanation. Things go missing sometimes, one of them said with a shrug. Old documents, improperly filed, they fall apart or get misplaced during moves. It happens. But documents don't delete themselves from the catalogue system. They don't remove themselves from filing cabinets. Someone had gone into the archives and erased all evidence that the folder had ever been there. Some stories refuse to die. They linger in the margins of history, whispered in the dark, impossible to prove, but equally impossible to completely dismiss. The fourth exit is one of those stories, a door that might have existed, a life that might have continued in secret, a truth that someone desperately wants to remain hidden. You can believe the official history. April 30th, 1945. The bunker. The body burned beyond recognition. The war's end. The monster destroyed. Justice served, however, imperfectly. Or you can wonder, because the documents existed, at least for one afternoon in an archive reading room, the witnesses spoke, at least in private, before they died. The evidence, for a brief moment, was real enough to touch, to photograph, to hold in trembling hands, and then it vanished. Just like the man himself supposedly vanished on that April day in 1945, leaving behind only burned remains that might have been him or might have been someone else, dental records that changed with each telling, and a story everyone accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. What if the alternative was true? What if the greatest criminal in history escaped justice and lived out his days in comfortable exile, dying peacefully in a monastery, while his victims had been given no such mercy? That would mean the entire post-war order was built on a lie. It would mean the narrative of justice and accountability was fiction. It would mean powerful people and institutions had conspired for decades to protect that lie. It would mean asking uncomfortable questions about who knew what, when they knew it, and why they chose to keep it secret. Maybe that's why the evidence disappeared. Maybe that's why Eamon Weiss died young from an unexpected heart attack. Maybe that's why anyone who gets too close to this truth finds themselves warned away or worse. Because some truths are too dangerous. Some doors should remain closed. Some ghosts should stay buried. Or maybe we're meant to wonder forever, caught between proof and doubt, between history and mystery, never quite certain what really happened in those final chaotic days when Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed and the most wanted man in the world supposedly took his own life, the fourth exit. If it existed, Adolf Hitler walked through it and vanished into legend. If it didn't, then we're chasing shadows, seeing patterns where none exist, believing in conspiracies because the truth is too mundane. But I know what Eamon Weiss saw in that monastery. I know what he recorded in his final statement, and I know that 3 years after finding those documents, he died under circumstances that were perhaps not as natural as they appeared. Draw your own conclusions, believe what you choose to believe, but remember that history is written by the victors, and sometimes the victors have reasons to protect certain lies. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most enduring mysteries, please leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. Did Hitler escape? Is it possible? Or is this just one more conspiracy theory in a world full of them? What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? We love hearing from our global community. And don't forget to use those hype points if you want to support the channel. Every bit helps us keep bringing you these stories, these investigations into the dark corners of history where truth and legend blur together. Until next time, sleep well, or try to. Because some ghosts never truly rest, and some truths, once uncovered, can never be entirely forgotten, no matter how many people try to bury them. The fourth exit. Real or imagined, it represents a question we may never definitively answer. But perhaps asking the question is enough. Perhaps keeping the mystery alive, refusing to accept easy answers, maintaining that healthy skepticism of official narratives, maybe that's how we honour both history and truth. Good night. And remember, the world is full of secrets. Some are meant to be discovered. Others are meant to destroy those who find them. The trick is knowing which is which before it's too late. Sleep well.